I stood at the kitchen table, my plane ticket still shaking in my hand, as my daughter's words sliced through the morning calm. "Dad, you're too old to travel alone." Too old. The same hands that once built her home, the same heart that buried her mother, now suddenly unfit to hold a passport. The laughter in her voice stung more than anger ever could. I'd spent a lifetime teaching her how to chase dreams, and now she was clipping mine. But she didn't know the one thing age had taught me better than time itself: how to disappear quietly and rise even quieter. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Franklin Wells's study, dust motes drifting like soft ghosts in the air. The room smelled faintly of old paper and pipe tobacco, remnants of a man who once lectured about Hemingway and Keats, but now spent his days organizing memories. On his desk lay a worn leather scrapbook, its spine faded, the gold lettering barely legible. Paris, 1987, someday. Frank's fingers hesitated before opening it. Inside, photographs of his late wife, Eleanor, smiling beside the Eiffel Tower cut from a travel brochure, her handwriting looping in blue ink beside it. For our someday. His throat tightened. "Someday," he whispered, voice catching. "It's time." He sat down at his computer, the same one his daughter Laura had set up, cluttered with icons she said would make things easier. His knuckles trembled slightly as he typed "Flight to Paris." The screen filled with options. Glossy pictures of planes, prices that made his heart beat faster. He had spent 40 years saving, modestly, quietly, for a dream he'd shared with a woman who never made it long enough to see it. Click by click, he booked it all. First-class ticket, boutique hotel near Montparnasse, walking tours through the Louvre, and quiet cafes. The itinerary wasn't extravagant, just deeply intentional. Every stop something Eleanor once circled in the scrapbook. When the final confirmation email arrived, he exhaled, slow and trembling, as if a long locked door inside him had finally creaked open. That evening at Laura's house, dinner was as usual, efficient, bright, and slightly cold. Laura moved briskly between dishes, her voice sharp in its control. Her husband, Eric, scrolled through his phone at the table. Grace, their teenage daughter, doodled quietly in a corner. Frank waited until everyone had food before saying it. "I finally did it," he said softly. "I'm going to Paris." Laura laughed before she even looked up. "Dad, you can barely handle Uber, and you want to cross the Atlantic." Her words sliced through the air with the casual cruelty of someone who thought she was being practical. Eric chuckled under his breath. "That's a long trip, Frank. You sure you can handle all that solo travel?" Frank smiled, steady and polite. "I've handled more complicated things in my life." Grace's head lifted. "Paris?" she said, eyes bright. "Can you bring me a snow globe and maybe a postcard from the Eiffel Tower?" Frank's heart warmed instantly. "I'll bring you too." Laura sighed. "Dad, please don't do something impulsive. If you get lost, who's going to—" He cut her off gently. "I'll be fine, Laura." She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, it's your money." That line landed heavy. For a moment, silence filled the table, broken only by the sound of cutlery. Grace gave her grandfather a shy smile. Frank nodded to her, grateful. Later that night, back in his own house, the glow of the computer screen lit his study like a confessional booth. The printer hummed, spitting out the thick boarding pass with his name embossed in clean black ink. Franklin Wells, Paris, CDG. He ran his fingers along the edges as if it were sacred text. He took out the scrapbook again and slipped the ticket inside the back pocket, behind the last page Eleanor had ever written on. A pressed lavender sprig taped next to the words, "When we go, we'll sit by the river and pretend we're 20 again." Frank smiled, the kind of smile that held both grief and triumph. He rose from the desk, walked to the framed photograph of Eleanor by the bookshelf, her laughter frozen in time, and whispered, "We're finally going." For a moment, the room seemed to breathe with him. Outside, wind moved through the maple trees, the same trees they'd planted together decades ago. The quiet felt full, not empty. He placed the scrapbook carefully in the drawer beneath his travel journal, locking it with a small brass key. Habit, not secrecy. Still, he hesitated before turning off the light, glancing once more at the photo. In the reflection of the glass, his face looked older than he felt. Lined, yes, but steady, ready. He turned off the lamp, and the room went dark, except for the faint moonlight glinting off the silver key. Down the hall, his phone buzzed with a new message from Laura. "Dad, call me when you see this. We need to talk about your finances." Frank stared at it for a long moment, the screen's glow reflected in his glasses. Then slowly, he set the phone face down on the desk. He looked toward Eleanor's picture once more. "Let them talk," he murmured. "We've waited long enough." Outside, a distant train horn drifted through the quiet Pennsylvania night, a sound that felt, somehow, like departure. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filled Laura's dining room, masking the tension that had begun to quietly nest between the family members. The house was modern, all glass and gray stone, a sharp contrast to Frank's warm, book-lined home. He sat at the far end of the long oak table, his napkin folded perfectly on his lap, the faint hum of classical music playing from the kitchen speaker. Eric carved the chicken with exaggerated precision, smiling too easily. "You know, Frank," he said, his voice smooth, "Laura and I were just talking about how lucky we are you're still sharp with numbers. Not many your age manage finances as well as you do." Frank smiled politely, though something about the phrasing, "your age," made the food taste duller. "I try to keep track," he said. "Routine helps." Laura laughed lightly, swirling her wine. "Dad's always been organized. I still remember the envelope system for our grocery money. You'd write bread, milk, and books, like we were running a small bank." "Worked, didn't it?" Frank replied, his tone soft but steady. Eric leaned back in his chair. "Speaking of banks," he began, eyes flicking to Laura in quiet coordination. "We've been thinking, maybe your savings could do more for you, or rather, for the family." Frank's fork froze mid-air. "My savings?" Eric nodded, feigning casual warmth. "Just a thought. You've got that travel fund, right? Maybe it's smarter to put it towards something lasting. Family security, investments, something Grace can benefit from down the line." Laura joined in seamlessly, her tone bright, rehearsed. "Eric's right, Dad. The market's unpredictable, and traveling alone at your age, well, it's risky. Maybe hold off for now. You could even refund that ticket." Grace, seated beside her grandfather, looked up sharply. "Refund it? But Grandpa's been planning this for years." Laura shot her daughter a look. "Grace, it's not that simple." Frank's chest tightened, but he forced a mild smile. "I appreciate the concern," he said carefully, "but I've already made arrangements." Eric chuckled softly, cutting into his meal. Of course. We're just trying to help. But if you ever change your mind, I could handle the refund for you. Airlines can be tricky with policies." The suggestion landed like a soft insult wrapped in kindness. Frank heard what wasn't said. "You're not capable. Let me manage your affairs." Grace's fork scraped against her plate. "Why would he need help?" she muttered. Laura sighed. "Sweetheart, Grandpa just isn't as used to all the online stuff." Frank looked between them. His daughter, her husband, his granddaughter, 3 generations separated by trust. "I've managed my affairs longer than you've both been alive," he said finally, his voice gentle but edged. Eric raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, we're just talking. No offense." "None taken," Frank replied, but the air between them had shifted. The conversation stumbled after that, reduced to awkward laughter and small talk about Grace's art classes. When dinner ended, Laura insisted on packing leftovers for Frank. "You never eat enough," she said, stacking containers with motherly briskness. He thanked her, though his gratitude felt mechanical. Grace hugged him tightly before he left, whispering, "Don't let them stop you." Outside, the night was cool and quiet. Frank walked slowly to his car, the street lamps flickering above him like tired eyes. Inside, he sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the soft echo of their conversation replaying in his mind. Refund the ticket, family security, handle the account. When he got home, the house greeted him with silence. He placed the leftovers in the fridge, turned off the kitchen light, and moved toward his study. The Paris scrapbook still sat in the drawer, the boarding pass tucked neatly inside. He ran his thumb along the edge of it, a reminder that his dream was still intact, even if his dignity felt bruised. He started toward his bedroom, but stopped midway down the hall. A faint sound drifted through the thin evening air, the echo of voices outside his window. He paused, heart beating faster. It was Laura and Eric's voices, faint but clear, drifting through the open phone line on his kitchen counter. He had forgotten to hang up after Grace's call. "His account should have a transfer option," Eric was saying, voice low. "Don't push him yet," Laura whispered back. "He'll get suspicious." Frank stood frozen in the dark, the realization hitting cold and deep. He turned off the light, the room swallowed by shadow. His reflection in the window looked older, yes. But suddenly, there was something sharper in his eyes. The quiet hum of betrayal filled the air, steady and alive. Rain tapped gently against the windows of Frank's living room, the steady rhythm blending with the soft hum of a television news broadcast. He sat in his recliner, reading glasses perched low on his nose, the Paris itinerary spread out on his lap like a map of promise. Each museum name, each cafe address, felt like a heartbeat of the life he'd put on hold for far too long. Then came the knock, brisk, familiar. Laura. She entered without waiting for his answer, shaking off her umbrella, already talking. "Dad, you have to hear this," she said, setting her phone on the table. "It's about an elderly man from Scranton who collapsed abroad, alone. No one found him for hours." Frank frowned. "That's terrible." Laura pressed play. A local news anchor's voice filled the room, grim and clinical. "Authorities say the 72-year-old man suffered a medical emergency while traveling solo in Rome." Laura clicked the screen off before the report ended. "See? This is what I've been saying. Traveling alone at your age, it's dangerous." Frank stared at her, his hand tightening slightly on the armrest. "Laura, one man's tragedy doesn't mean I shouldn't live." "It's not about living, Dad," she said, crouching down beside him, tone soft, but dripping with control. "It's about being realistic. What if something happens to you? Who's there to help? Who's there to even know?" He looked away, eyes settling on the framed photo of Eleanor on the mantel. "I've managed alone for years." Laura sighed, her patience measured. "That's different. You're not getting on a plane across the ocean. You don't even like elevators." A small silence followed, heavy with unspoken insult. Frank folded the itinerary slowly, like someone closing a door. The excitement that had colored his face just hours before faded into uncertainty. "Maybe I was rushing things," he said quietly. Laura stood, victorious but pretending concern. "I just don't want you to get hurt, Dad. We'll figure out something nice here at home. A little trip somewhere nearby." As she left, Frank stared at the door for a long time, her words echoing inside his chest. The Paris dream, once so vivid, now felt fragile, like glass in his hands. He sat there long after the rain stopped, listening to the house creak, the silence swallowing him whole. That evening, as dusk settled over the quiet Pennsylvania street, the phone rang. Frank hesitated before answering. "Frank?" a warm, familiar voice said. "It's Irene Porter." A smile flickered across his tired face. "Irene. My God, it's been years." "Too many. She laughed. I heard from an old colleague you finally booked that Paris trip. I just wanted to say, it's about time. Frank's shoulders eased, a faint spark lighting behind his eyes. You're in Paris? Next month, I'm taking my book club. Well, the adventurous half of it. You should come with us. Group rates, good company, and less chance of getting lost in translation. For the first time in days, Frank felt the warmth of possibility again. That sounds perfect. They talked for nearly an hour, reminiscing about teaching, poetry, and the promise of second chances. By the end, his decision felt certain again. He'd go. He'd live the dream, not out of rebellion, but out of quiet devotion to Eleanor, to the man he used to be. When Laura stopped by the next morning, he greeted her with unusual brightness. Irene called, he said. She's invited me to join her group trip. Everything organized, safe. You can relax now. Laura froze, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. Irene Porter? Yes, we'll be in good hands. Laura's expression tightened. Dad, Irene's always been, well, impulsive. Remember when she lost her passport in Greece? That's who you're trusting now? Frank's smile faltered. She's a friend, Laura. And I'm tired of putting my life on hold. Grace, passing through the hallway, stopped at the sound of their raised voices. Laura's tone sharpened. You're being irresponsible. I'm being alive, Frank replied, steady but quiet. Grace stepped into the doorway, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom, maybe Grandpa just wants to feel alive. The room stilled. Laura looked at her daughter, then at her father, her control slipping, if only for a moment. Frank's eyes softened as he looked at Grace, a silent thank you in his gaze. Laura exhaled through her nose, cold and dismissive. We'll talk about this later, she said, grabbing her purse. The door clicked behind her. Frank stood there, the silence thick again. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt like defiance beginning to breathe. He turned toward the phone, still resting on the table, Irene's voice echoing faintly in his memory. It's about time. He smiled, a hint of resolve returning. Yes, he murmured. It is. The bank smelled of polished marble and faint coffee, that sterile scent of order and quiet authority. Frank adjusted his jacket, nodding politely to the young teller as he approached the counter. Good morning. I'd like to review my travel funds, he said, his voice steady but polite, the tone of a man used to being respected. The teller smiled, clicking through her computer. Of course, Mr. Wells. Do you want me to print your account summary? He nodded, tapping his fingers on the cool countertop as he waited. Through the glass partitions, he could see posters about retirement planning and safe financial futures. It all felt too neat, too rehearsed, like promises that came with fine print. The teller frowned slightly. It looks like your co-signer might have already requested a recent statement. Frank blinked. Co-signer? Yes, she said. A Miss Laura Wells. She's listed as joint owner, added about 6 years ago. Frank's heart slowed. That's my daughter, but that's impossible. This account was mine long before. The teller turned the monitor slightly, showing the digital signature line. There it was, clear as day. Laura A. Wells, added for emergency access. Frank's throat felt dry. Emergency access, he repeated softly, like the words were foreign currency in his mouth. The teller smiled apologetically. That's what most families do, sir, just in case. He nodded stiffly. Right, just in case. She printed the statement, sliding it across the counter. Also, sir, there was a transfer inquiry last week. We didn't process it since your signature was missing. Frank's eyes flicked up. Transfer inquiry? From who? The teller hesitated. The request came through under the secondary name, Mr. Eric Nolan. The name hit him like a shove to the chest. Eric, his son-in-law. the one who joked about family security over dinner. His pulse thudded in his ears. "I see," he said quietly. "Would you like to freeze the account, sir?" she asked gently. He shook his head. No, not yet. I'll take care of it myself." He walked out slowly, the glass doors reflecting his pale face back at him. Outside, the sun felt harsh, too bright. His hands shook as he fumbled with his car keys. How long had this been going on? 6 years, she'd said. 6 years of quiet control hiding behind a word like emergency. He drove to Laura's house, each turn heavier than the last. The street looked picture perfect, manicured lawns, pastel shutters, everything in its place. He rang the doorbell, and Laura opened it with that automatic daughterly smile that no longer reached her eyes. "Dad, what a surprise. Come in." He didn't move. "We need to talk," he said. Her smile faltered. "What's wrong?" "You added yourself to my bank account." She blinked, then forced a light laugh. "Oh, that. Dad, you're not still upset about that, are you? We did that years ago, for emergencies. You agreed to it." "I did not," Frank said, voice low, trembling not from age, but fury. "And Eric tried to transfer money out of it." Laura's tone softened, the kind people use when talking to children. "You must be mistaken. Eric wouldn't do that. The banker showed me his name." She tilted her head, still smiling, though her eyes hardened. "Dad, you've always been a little forgetful with paperwork. It's probably a mix-up." "Don't patronize me," he said sharply. The room fell silent. Laura's smile didn't break, but her tone did. "Dad, I'm just trying to keep you safe. You could have been scammed or lost something while traveling. You should be grateful we're looking out for you." He stepped back, staring at her like she was someone he didn't recognize. "Grateful," he whispered. "You take my signature, my money, my choice. And I'm supposed to thank you." "Dad," she sighed, "you're overreacting. You're imagining things." The words struck him harder than a slap. "You're imagining things." He'd heard that tone before, from doctors, from strangers who saw only age and fragility. But from his daughter, it felt crueler. He turned toward the door. "If this is how you protect me, Laura," he said, voice shaking, "then I'd rather be unsafe." He didn't wait for her to reply. Outside, the sky had dimmed to a grayish dusk, matching the hollow ache inside his chest. The drive home blurred past in silence, the kind that presses against your ribs until you can't breathe. When he stepped into his study, the familiar scent of paper and dust grounded him. He sat down, staring at the Paris ticket still resting in the drawer. He pulled it out slowly, smoothing the creases with trembling fingers. It gleamed faintly under the desk lamp, a fragile, tangible symbol of the freedom that was slipping from him piece by piece. His reflection in the window looked smaller, older, but behind the weary eyes, something sharp began to form. He placed the ticket on the desk and whispered to the empty room, "No more." The silence that followed wasn't weak. It pulsed with something dangerous, something alive. Frank's kitchen table was covered in neatly stacked papers, flight itineraries, insurance confirmations, hotel reservations. Each page was a small triumph of independence, a final stand for a man determined to live on his own terms. He'd even written a checklist in careful cursive: passport, euros, prescriptions. Everything was ready. Laura arrived unannounced that morning, carrying her usual air of cheerful intrusion. "Dad," she said, setting down her coffee cup without asking, "I thought I'd help you organize for the trip, make sure you've got everything in order." Frank hesitated. "I already have, Laura." She smiled too wide. "I know, but you've always been a little scatterbrained when you're excited." He watched as she began sorting through his things, touching what didn't need touching. His folders, his small pile of cash, even the envelope with his passport. "Please, be careful with that," he said. She waved him off. "Relax, Dad. I'm just making sure it's not expired or something." Frank forced a breath through his nose and stepped back, letting her hover. The morning sunlight through the blinds cast stripes across the table, neat lines dividing order from intrusion. After a few minutes, Laura gathered everything into her tote bag. "I'll take these home to make copies for you. Safer that way," Frank frowned. "I don't need copies." "It'll give me peace of mind," she said, already heading toward the door. "Don't worry. I'll drop them back tomorrow." But tomorrow came and went. So did the next day. By the third day, Frank was pacing. His flight was a week away. The envelope with his passport hadn't returned. He called Laura twice. No answer. When she finally did pick up, her voice was smooth as silk. "Dad, I think I might have misplaced your passport. I'm so sorry. I must have mixed it with the mortgage documents or something." "Misplaced," he repeated. "It's fine," she said quickly. "I'll check again tomorrow. Maybe it's a sign you shouldn't go gallivanting across the ocean alone. You shouldn't be alone in a foreign city, Dad. Anything could happen." Her tone was patronizing, protective in all the wrong ways. Frank closed his eyes. "It wasn't your decision to make." "Then why do I feel like I'm the only one being reasonable?" she snapped. "You're 70. Dad, people your age break hips getting off curbs." He hung up before his anger turned to something less controlled. The house felt unbearably quiet after that. He tore through his study, opening drawers, rifling through files, hoping, praying, that she'd left it somewhere by mistake. But the envelope was gone. His symbol of freedom had vanished. Down the hall, the phone rang. Grace's voice carried through the receiver, hesitant but warm. "Hi, Grandpa. Mom's acting weird. Did something happen?" He hesitated, unwilling to drag her into the storm. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just a little mix-up." After they hung up, Grace wandered into the kitchen, where Laura was emptying the trash. Something caught her eye, a small flash of navy blue beneath crumpled paper and coffee filters. She froze. Slowly, she reached in and pulled it out. It was Frank's passport, torn straight down the middle, pages creased and stained with coffee grounds. Her breath hitched. "Mom!" Laura turned sharply, eyes flashing. "Grace, don't touch that." "You said you lost it." Laura's jaw clenched. "It was an accident." Grace stared at her, torn between love and disgust. She didn't speak. Instead, she quietly tucked the broken passport back into the trash and turned away. For the first time, she didn't recognize her mother. That night, the phone rang again in Frank's house. Irene's familiar voice broke through the silence. "Frank, just checking in. I booked the group tickets. Did you get your travel insurance sorted?" Frank swallowed hard. "Irene, about that. I decided to cancel the trip." Her surprise was immediate. "Cancel? Why?" He forced a weak chuckle. "It's just not the right time. Maybe next year." A pause. "Frank, is something wrong?" He stared at the empty table, at the pile of documents that now meant nothing. "No, Irene, everything's fine." When he hung up, the house went utterly still. He sat down heavily at the table, the lamplight casting deep shadows over his face. His hands, once steady, now trembled as he traced the outline where his passport had once lain. All those years of saving, of dreaming, of promising Eleanor they'd see Paris together, undone with one deceitful act. He covered his face, shoulders shaking, though no sound escaped. It wasn't just about a trip anymore. It was about the slow, quiet theft of his dignity. When the tears dried, he looked up at the photo of Eleanor by the mantel. Her eyes, forever kind, seemed to look back at him with something sharper, a question. He wiped his face, straightened his posture. The sadness settled into something quieter, colder. Beneath the grief, a small ember began to glow, faint but alive. Frank whispered to the empty room, "If they want control so badly, they'll see what it costs." Outside, the night deepened. The wind carried through the trees like a distant warning. The phone call came on a gray Thursday morning. Frank was at his desk, trying to ignore the empty space where his passport used to rest. The Paris itinerary sat folded beside his coffee mug, a souvenir from a trip that would never happen. "Hey, Frank," Eric's voice came, smooth as oil. "Listen, I talked to Laura about your ticket situation. The airline's being difficult with the refund process, but I can help. I handle stuff like this all the time for clients." Frank rubbed his temple. "It's already paid. I can contact them myself." Eric chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that made Frank's jaw tighten. "No need to stress yourself. You'd have to fill out a bunch of digital forms, attach proof of cancellation, wait for weeks. Just forward me the confirmation email, and I'll handle it for you. Easy." Frank hesitated. Something in him resisted, an instinct that had been trampled too many times lately. Still, the exhaustion of fighting, of being doubted and dismissed, was heavy. "Fine," he said finally, "but I'd like to see the refund once it's processed." "Of course, Frank. You'll get every penny," Eric said, the grin audible in his voice. When the call ended, Frank sat there staring at the silent phone. He wanted to believe it. He needed to. But belief, he was starting to realize, was a young man's habit. Days passed. The weekend came and went. No refund appeared. On Monday, Frank logged into his account, or rather, the joint account he'd discovered he shared with his daughter. The balance hadn't changed. He checked his email. No confirmation, no correspondence from the airline, nothing. He called Eric. "Any news on that refund?" Eric sounded distracted, maybe even amused. "Yeah, it's in progress. You know how airlines are. Bureaucracy on top of bureaucracy. They said it could take a couple more days." Frank listened, saying nothing, his hand tightening on the receiver. That evening, Laura stopped by, unannounced. Again. Her smile was sweet, practiced. "Dad, come outside. I want you to see something." He followed her to the driveway. Parked in the sunlight was a brand new SUV, black, sleek, the kind of car that whispered expensive. Eric stood beside it, hands in his pockets, pretending modesty. "Got a great deal," he said. "Timing was perfect." Frank's eyes drifted to the chrome logo glinting on the hood, his reflection fractured in its shine. "Timing," he repeated slowly. Laura laughed, misreading the expression on his face. "We needed something safer for Grace. You know how these Pennsylvania winters get. And Eric's car was on its last legs." Frank nodded absently. "And the refund?" Eric blinked. "What refund?" "The airline," Frank said evenly. "You said you'd handle it." Eric's face shifted for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Oh, that. Still processing, I think. Maybe next week." Laura looped her arm through Eric's. "Dad, please don't worry about it. You'll get it eventually. And anyway, it's not like the money's wasted. We're family. It's all our future." Frank looked at her then. Really looked. The same eyes that once cried when she scraped her knee now stared back with the confidence of someone who had rewritten the meaning of love. "Our future," he echoed softly. She smiled, oblivious. "Exactly." He said nothing more. He just turned, walked back toward the house, and closed the door behind him. Inside, the walls felt smaller. The ticking clock on the mantel sounded too loud. He sat in his study, staring at the remnants of his once-ordered life. The empty drawer where his passport had been, the closed scrapbook marked Paris, 1987. Someday, the printout of a ticket to nowhere. His hands rested on the desk, trembling slightly, until they didn't. The trembling stopped. The stillness that followed wasn't resignation. It was something deeper. For the first time in weeks, Frank didn't feel helpless. He felt aware. He understood now that Laura's love wasn't the kind that nurtured. It was the kind that consumed, cloaked in concern, sharpened by control. He rose slowly, turned off the lamp, and stood before the window. Outside, the gleaming new SUV caught the porch light, its surface smooth and soulless. Family, he murmured, bitterness curling the word. He returned to the desk and pulled the Paris ticket from its drawer. The paper had creased over time, soft from the number of times he'd held it. He smoothed it out carefully, like a soldier tending to an old flag. His reflection in the glass window looked different now. Older, yes, but colder, calculating. He whispered to himself, barely audible. Then I'll show them what the future really looks like. And in that dim, quiet room, a plan began to take shape. Slow, deliberate, and silent as smoke. The printer hummed softly in the dark of Frank's study, its faint light flickering against the walls lined with books and ghosts. The whirring sound filled the quiet, a steady rhythm of defiance. He sat motionless, glasses low on his nose, watching the paper slide out. A new boarding pass, his name printed clean and sharp in bold black ink. Franklin Wells, Paris, CDG. He had done it carefully this time. Different card, different account. No trail Laura or Eric could trace. Just a man reclaiming the one thing they'd tried to steal. His right to decide his own life. He held the ticket for a long moment, letting its weight settle in his hand. It wasn't just paper. It was power, quiet and absolute. He folded it once, precisely, then slipped it into an envelope. His handwriting, though slower than it used to be, was deliberate as he wrote a single word across the front. Laura. For a moment, he just stared at it. There was no anger now, just a strange calm. The kind that comes when a storm inside you has run out of lightning but not resolve. Morning came pale and cold. Frank brewed coffee the way Eleanor used to. Strong, slightly burnt, grounding. The house smelled like old comfort. He set 2 mugs on the table, though only one would be needed. He'd invited Laura for breakfast, saying simply, "We need to talk before the weekend." The knock came precisely at 9. Her voice, cheerful but wary, followed it. "Dad, you're not canceling something again, are you?" Frank smiled faintly. "Come in." Laura stepped inside, scanning the kitchen with habitual critique. "You still haven't replaced that toaster. You know, you should really let me handle these things." He gestured to the chair. "Sit, I made coffee." She did, taking a sip before wrinkling her nose. Too bitter as always. Frank smiled to himself. Maybe it's an acquired taste. The silence between them stretched, fragile and charged. Then Laura broke it with a laugh that wasn't really laughter. "So, what's this about? Don't tell me you rebooked that Paris thing again. You still think you can handle airports?" Her tone dripped amusement, the kind that hides fear. Frank didn't answer. He reached beside him, lifted the white envelope, and slid it across the table toward her. "You're right," he said softly. "Maybe you should go instead." Laura blinked, confused. "What?" He gestured toward it. "Open it." She hesitated, then tore the flap. Inside, the glossy print gleamed under the morning light. Her eyes widened. "Boarding pass," she murmured. "Paris. Tomorrow morning?" Frank nodded, his face unreadable. First-class seat, boutique hotel, all arranged. "Dad," she started, voice wavering. You booked this for me?" He sipped his coffee, calm. "You said I couldn't handle it. Maybe you can. Take pictures for me. See what all the fuss is about." The words hung in the air, deceptively kind, wrapped in something she couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps, or punishment. Laura looked at him, searching for warmth and finding only quiet certainty. "I don't understand." "I know," he said simply, standing up. "You usually don't." She stared at the ticket, the reality dawning in slow, sharp waves. The same ticket she'd tried to destroy, now sitting in her hands, a symbol she could no longer control. "Dad, this isn't funny," she said finally, forcing a shaky laugh. "It's not meant to be." He turned, grabbed his coat from the chair, and walked toward the front door. "Where are you going?" she called after him. He paused, hand on the doorknob, and looked back over his shoulder. The light from the window hit his face, softening the hard lines that time and betrayal had carved there. "To have breakfast somewhere quiet," he said, "and maybe start a new plan." Then he stepped outside. The door closed gently behind him, but the silence it left was loud. Laura sat at the table, still holding the ticket, her mind racing. For the first time, she couldn't tell if she'd won or just been outplayed. The air felt different now, heavier, unfamiliar. She looked down at the boarding pass again, her reflection faintly visible in its glossy surface. The date, the destination, the seat number, all real, all unshakable. "Tomorrow," she whispered to herself. Outside, through the kitchen window, Frank's figure disappeared down the path, calm, deliberate, untouchable. In his absence, the ticking clock on the wall grew louder, each second pressing into her like an accusation. Somewhere deep down, Laura realized she'd just been moved in a game she didn't even know she was still playing. The morning sky was still gray when Laura and Eric pulled into the Philadelphia International Airport, their new SUV gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the drop-off lane. Laura's heels clicked briskly on the pavement as she adjusted her sunglasses, though the sun hadn't yet risen. "Can you believe he finally came to his senses?" she said, smiling at her husband. "A gift. First class. He's learning to be generous." Eric smirked. "Hey, maybe he realized we'd make better use of it. He probably didn't even know what to do with those miles." Laura laughed, sliding her designer bags higher on her shoulder. "Paris, here we come." She snapped a quick selfie of them by the departure sign, her manicured hand flashing the printed boarding pass Frank had left in the envelope. The caption was ready before they even entered the terminal. "Paris, here we come." The flash from her phone lit her face with brief triumph. Meanwhile, across the airport, several terminals away, Franklin Wells stood quietly in line at a different check-in counter. The crowd around him bustled with energy, families with strollers, businessmen with laptops, the chatter of languages he didn't recognize. He blended easily, a simple traveler with a small suitcase and a calm expression that hid the tremor in his hands. The name on his boarding pass read Henry Porter, a borrowed alias, crafted from his middle name and the surname of his old colleague, Irene. It wasn't deceit for greed, it was for freedom, the only way to step beyond the reach of those who had taken too much already. He moved slowly through the line, breathing deeply. His body was old, but his resolve had never felt stronger. Every beep of the scanner, every footstep forward, was a pulse of quiet rebellion. His phone buzzed in his pocket. One message, from Grace. "Go live, Grandpa." He smiled. She knew. Somehow, she always knew. At Terminal A, Laura and Eric breezed through security, laughing, posting updates, complaining about the line. "Dad must have pulled some strings," Laura said, admiring the first-class boarding lane. "I almost feel guilty." Eric grinned. "Don't. He wanted to make up for all that drama." Laura's phone pinged, notifications from friends reacting to their photo. "So jealous. You two are living the dream." She beamed, glancing at the boarding pass again. Everything felt perfect. Back at Terminal F, Frank clutched his own ticket, fingers trembling slightly. He had made it this far without hesitation, but standing at the gate now, he felt the enormity of what he was doing. His wife's voice echoed in his memory, Eleanor's gentle laugh, her promise written in blue ink all those years ago. Paris, 1987, someday. He whispered, "Someday is today." The gate agent smiled warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Porter. Bon voyage." Frank's chest lifted with a quiet breath of victory. As he stepped down the jetway, the air smelled of fuel and metal, the scent of movement, of leaving. For the first time in years, no one was telling him where he could or couldn't go. At the other end of the terminal, the world was about to tilt. Laura handed her passport and printed ticket to the gate agent, still chatting with Eric about the shopping she planned to do on the Champs-Élysées. The agent scanned the pass once, then again. Beep. Red light. The woman said. It looks like this ticket has already been used. Laura blinked. That's not possible. My father booked it yesterday. The agent checked again, polite but firm. I'm sorry, ma'am, but this boarding pass is invalid. It was scanned earlier this morning under another name. Eric frowned. There must be some mistake. Check again. Another beep. The same red light. Laura's pulse quickened. You don't understand. My father... Already boarded. The agent interrupted gently, turning the screen so they could see the record. Flight 802 to Paris, first class. Passenger, Franklin Wells. Departure at 7:45 a.m. For a moment, Laura couldn't speak. The realization hit her all at once. The envelope, the smirk, the way he'd said, "You'll love it there. Take pictures." Her mouth went dry. Eric leaned in close, voice sharp with disbelief. He played us? She stared at the red light still blinking on the scanner, her face draining of color. He's on that plane. The intercom above them crackled to life. Flight 802 to Paris, now boarding. Final call. Laura turned toward the nearest window just in time to see a plane taxiing away from the gate, silver wings glinting against the pale morning sky. At that exact moment, somewhere on that aircraft, Frank settled into his seat by the window. He opened the worn scrapbook that lay in his lap, the one marked Paris, 1987, someday, and smiled faintly. His hands trembled as he ran a finger over Eleanor's handwriting. He wasn't angry anymore, not even bitter. What filled him now was peace, quiet, defiant peace. His revenge had begun, not with shouting or punishment, but with motion, with freedom. He looked out at the clouds forming on the horizon, whispering softly, "We're finally on our way." Back in the terminal, Laura stood frozen, clutching her useless boarding pass, her phone still open on the selfie they'd taken minutes ago. The caption glared up at her. "Paris, here we come." For the first time in years, she had no control, only disbelief, and Frank's flight lifted gently into the gray morning sky, carrying with it the first chapter of his quiet reckoning. The gate area hummed with the sound of rolling suitcases and distant boarding calls, but Laura heard none of it. Her eyes were locked on the gate agent's screen, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "What do you mean the ticket is used?" she demanded. The agent remained composed, repeating the same line. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this boarding pass has already been scanned. Passenger, Franklin Wells. The flight departed 10 minutes ago." Laura blinked as if the words didn't compute. "That's impossible. My father gave me that ticket. He said it was mine." Behind her, Eric shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the people starting to stare. "Laura, calm down," he muttered. "Don't tell me to calm down," she snapped, her voice cracking under the weight of humiliation. She leaned toward the counter. "Check again. Maybe the system made a mistake, or maybe someone used a duplicate ticket." The agent's polite smile didn't change. "We've confirmed it twice. There's no error." Confusion twisted into panic. Her father's voice replayed in her mind. "You'll love it there. Take pictures." That infuriating calm, that hint of something she hadn't seen in him for years, confidence. Eric stepped forward, raising his voice. "Listen, this is ridiculous. That's my father-in-law's name on the ticket, sure, but he booked it for us. You can't just let him take it and leave us here." The agent folded her hands. "Sir, the person whose name appears on the boarding pass is the only one authorized to use it. If that's not you, I can't help." Eric scoffed, then changed the name. "That's not possible, sir." The red light blinked again on the scanner, a steady pulse of finality. Laura's breathing grew shallow. He did this on purpose," she whispered. Eric turned toward her. "You think?" His sarcasm stung sharper than he intended. Maybe next time, you don't humiliate the man who paid for your lifestyle. Don't start, she hissed. No, seriously, Laura. His voice rose, drawing glances from travelers passing by. You've been treating him like a toddler for months, and now he's showing you he's not one. Her hand trembled as she fumbled for her phone. I'll call him, she muttered. Eric threw his hands up. Yeah, sure, because that's what he wants right now. Another lecture. But she was already dialing. Her fingers shook as the ringtone buzzed in her ear. Once, twice, 3 times. Then a click. Hello, Laura. The sound of his voice was calm. Too calm. Behind it, faintly, she could hear the gentle hum of an airplane cabin. And beneath that, soft French jazz drifting through the speakers. Dad, what the hell did you do? Her voice cracked. You left. You took the flight. You lied to me. He paused. She could almost picture him, composed, seated by the window, the clouds rolling past his reflection. I told you to take pictures, he said quietly. What? But before she could finish, the line went dead. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering against the tiled floor. Eric exhaled sharply. Well, I guess that's your answer. Laura bent to pick it up, her movement stiff, mechanical. He's on that plane, she said, voice hollow. Eric's jaw tightened. You think? She turned on him, fury replacing shock. This is your fault too. You pushed him. You told me to let you handle everything. He laughed bitterly. No, Laura, you handled him. You always do. Their argument blurred into noise, swallowed by the sounds of luggage wheels and boarding announcements. The crowd shifted, the world moving forward while they stood still. 2 people outplayed by a 70-year-old man they'd underestimated. Laura's hands shook as she looked again at the useless boarding pass, the letters of her father's name mocking her in bold print. She crushed it in her fist, eyes burning. He's not going to get away with this, she said through gritted teeth. But somewhere, high above the clouds, Frank Wells sat in seat 4A, looking out over the endless blue. The soft jazz in his headphones mingled with the drone of the engines. His face was serene, not the calm of surrender, but of quiet victory, the kind that doesn't need words. He reached into his jacket pocket, touching the folded photograph of Eleanor he carried everywhere. The light through the window haloed his reflection, and for the first time in years, he smiled. Not because he'd escaped, but because he'd finally begun to live. Below, the earth drifted away like a bad memory. The wheels touched down on the tarmac with a jolt that stirred Frank from a light doze. A soft announcement echoed through the cabin. Bienvenue à Paris. The words seemed to hang in the air, almost unreal. Paris. After decades of dreaming, of postponing, of being told no, he was finally here. As he stepped off the plane, the air was different, softer somehow, tinged with jet fuel and rain, and something else beneath it, the faint perfume of possibility. The terminal buzzed with motion and languages he hadn't heard in years. Frank moved slowly, steadying himself against the crowd. He felt the fatigue of travel, the weight of age in his knees, but also a pulse in his chest that felt almost youthful, the spark of a man who had crossed his own invisible ocean. Immigration was simple. The officer smiled at his passport, clean, new, no traces of the past. Business or pleasure, Monsieur Wells? He hesitated. Closure, he said quietly. Outside, Paris unfolded like a painting he'd only ever seen behind glass. The taxi ride from Charles de Gaulle to the city blurred into streaks of golden gray, the Seine flashing between bridges, the rooftops slanting against the silver sky. He sat silent in the back seat, eyes wide, taking in every detail. When the car stopped in front of a small boutique hotel on Rue Saint-André, a familiar voice called out, "Frank!" He turned, and there she was, Irene Porter. Her silver hair caught the daylight, and her face broke into a smile that was all warmth and history. "You made it," she said, embracing him tightly. "I knew you would." For a moment, the years seemed to peel away. "You don't know how good it is to see a familiar face," Frank said, his voice thick with relief. Irene laughed softly. Oh, I do. You look like a man who's been holding his breath for too long. They walked together through the narrow cobblestone streets, her arm lightly brushing his as she led him toward a small cafe, tucked between a florist and a bookstore, Le Papillon Bleu. The name gleamed in faded blue paint, exactly as it appeared in Eleanor's scrapbook. Frank stopped at the doorway, his throat tightening. She circled this place, he murmured, said the owner once served Sartre himself. Then we'd better sit at his table, Irene replied gently. Inside, the cafe was quiet, filled with the clinking of porcelain cups and the low hum of French conversation. They took a seat by the window. Frank ran his fingers along the wooden table, worn smooth by years of stories. It felt like touching the past. The waiter brought 2 cappuccinos. Frank stared into the foam, before speaking. You know, she always said Paris wasn't about romance. It was about courage, about stepping into something unfamiliar and calling it home. Irene smiled, watching him closely. And here you are. He nodded slowly. Here I am. But even as he said it, the ache rose again. Grief and triumph, woven together so tightly he couldn't separate them. He imagined Eleanor sitting across from him, smiling that half smile of hers, teasing him for ordering the wrong pastry. He blinked hard, forcing back the sting in his eyes. Outside, the afternoon light shifted, warm and golden now, reflecting off the Seine. The city was alive, and so, finally, was he. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him back. Laura's name flashed across the screen. Once, twice, then again. He let it ring out. The noise of it felt intrusive, foreign against the peace of the moment. It buzzed again. This time, he turned the phone over, silencing it completely. The cafe returned to quiet. Then another notification lit the screen. A message from Grace. Just 2 words. I'm proud of you. Frank exhaled slowly, a small, genuine smile breaking through the heaviness. The first real breath he'd taken in months. He looked out the window again, the world of Paris stretching before him. Vast, bright, indifferent. He raised his cup slightly, a silent toast to the life he'd almost let slip away. Here's to someday, he whispered. And for the first time in years, the words didn't ache. They felt like a beginning. The morning sunlight slipped through the blinds of Laura's kitchen, landing on the white marble counter where her laptop sat open. She was scrolling through bank statements, a mug of untouched coffee beside her. The numbers on the screen didn't make sense. Her brows furrowed. The account balance was wrong. Not low, not withdrawn by mistake. Empty. Every cent gone. She refreshed the page twice, her pulse quickening. Still empty. The joint savings account, the one she'd quietly monitored for years under the guise of family security, was blank. Eric, she shouted. He appeared from the hallway, half-dressed for work, tie loose around his neck. What's with the yelling? She turned the laptop toward him. Look, tell me you moved it. Tell me this is a glitch. Eric leaned in, eyes narrowing. What the hell? It's 0, completely 0. Laura's voice was tight. He must have noticed. Eric rubbed the back of his neck. You said he wouldn't notice. I said he couldn't handle the accounts anymore. He's 70, Eric. He slammed his palm on the counter, the sound sharp and final. Well, congratulations. He handled this one just fine. He's not just on vacation, Laura. He's outsmarted you. Laura's face flushed. Don't you dare talk to me like this. Eric paced, muttering. You don't get it. That money wasn't just his. That was the cushion, the backup for everything. I took out a new loan based on those funds being there. She froze. You what? Eric's tone turned defensive. I thought we had access. You said he'd never move it. The air in the kitchen thickened. Grace's footsteps creaked from upstairs. She hovered at the railing, unseen for now, listening. Laura folded her arms, voice trembling between anger and fear. We'll fix it. I'll call the bank. There's no way he could have... But the words died as she refreshed the screen again. The transfer description glowed in clean black font. Full withdrawal authorized by primary account holder. Transferred to Wells Travel Trust. Laura read it aloud in disbelief. A trust? He created a trust? Eric blinked. Travel trust? What does that even mean? It means, she said slowly, that every cent he had is legally protected now, under his name, and we can't touch it. A heavy silence followed. Down the hallway, Grace's hand covered her mouth. She'd known her grandfather was leaving, but not like this. She'd seen the quiet sorrow in his eyes before Paris, the way he carried betrayal like it was part of his posture. And now, hearing her mother's panic, it all made sense. In the kitchen, Eric was unraveling. You have no idea what this does to us, Laura. I can't even make the next mortgage payment without those funds. Laura's pride kicked in like armor. He'll come back. I'll talk to him. I'll reason with him. Reason? Eric laughed bitterly. You lied to him, humiliated him, stole from him. And now you want to reason? Enough, she shouted, slamming the laptop shut. I did what I did for this family. From the stairs, Grace's voice cut through the room, quiet but razor sharp. No, Mom. You did it for control. Laura turned, startled. Grace stood halfway down the steps, eyes bright with anger and disappointment. Don't talk to me like that, Laura snapped. Grace's voice trembled but didn't break. You treated him like a child, and now you're shocked he finally walked away? The silence after was brutal. Laura's eyes glistened, but she refused to let the tears fall. She picked up her phone, staring at the contact labeled Dad. Her thumb hovered over the call button, but she didn't press it. Pride wouldn't let her. Eric grabbed his jacket, voice cold. You wanted control, Laura. Now you have none. He left the kitchen, the slam of the door echoing through the house. Grace watched her mother sink onto a stool, her shoulders rigid, the first cracks of guilt beginning to show beneath the surface. Thousands of miles away, Paris glowed under the evening sky. Frank and Irene sat at a small table beneath the glittering iron silhouette of the Eiffel Tower, a bottle of red wine between them. The air was filled with soft laughter, the murmur of strangers in a dozen languages, and the slow hum of music from a nearby street performer. Frank swirled his glass, watching the reflection of the tower shimmer in the liquid. You know, he said quietly, some lessons cost less in money than in peace. Irene smiled gently. And which did this one cost you? He looked up, eyes warm and steady. Both, but I can live with that. As the Eiffel lights flickered on, his phone buzzed, Laura's name glowing on the screen. He silenced it without hesitation and placed the phone face down beside the wine. The city breathed around them, free, alive, and impossibly far from Pennsylvania. Frank raised his glass toward the sky. To peace, he whispered. The photo appeared online on an ordinary Tuesday morning, nestled between cafe reviews and tourist snapshots on a small Parisian travel blog. Two silver-haired travelers sitting outside a cafe beneath the Eiffel Tower, laughter caught midair, sunlight in their faces. The caption read, Two seniors proving age is no limit. Meet Franklin and Irene, traveling companions reminding us it's never too late for adventure. The image was simple, candid, perfect. Frank was leaning slightly forward, eyes lit with quiet joy, Irene beside him, gesturing with her glass of wine. Within hours, the post began to spread. Locals shared it for its charm. A U.S. expat group picked it up, then a lifestyle site reposted it with a headline, Elderly couple goes viral for living their dream in Paris. Back in Pennsylvania, Grace stumbled across it while scrolling through her phone before school. Her heart leapt when she recognized the familiar face, the way her grandpa's smile curved in that soft, knowing way. She pressed the screen closer, reading every line twice. She didn't tell her mother right away. Instead, she printed the photo on her small desk printer, the ink still damp when she carried it into the kitchen. Laura was sitting at the counter, scrolling through emails, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion and unspoken worry. Mom, Grace said quietly, placing the paper down in front of her. You should see this. Laura frowned, annoyed at the interruption, until her gaze fell on the image. Her father, Paris, the Eiffel Tower in the background. For a moment, she froze. Grace smiled faintly. That's your father, living his dream. The words landed softly, but they hit deep. Laura's throat tightened. She stared at the photo longer than she meant to, her reflection faint in the glossy paper. The article's title glared at her. Age is no limit. Her father looked free, happier than she'd seen him in years, maybe ever. Grace poured herself a glass of juice, pretending not to notice the silence stretching between them. When Eric came in, adjusting his tie, Laura wordlessly handed him the page. Look. He glanced at it, unimpressed. PR for old folks, he said, grabbing his briefcase. Good for him. Maybe he'll stay there. Laura's jaw tightened. It's not funny. I didn't say it was, he said, tone dismissive. But you're the one who wanted to control everything. Now he's the internet's favorite grandpa. Irony's not lost on me. She glared at him. You don't understand. Oh, I do. He took a sip of coffee, grimacing at the bitterness. You tried to keep him safe. Turns out he didn't need saving, just escaping. He set the mug down and left without another word. The sound of the door closing echoed through the house. Laura sat at the counter staring at the photo again. Her hand trembled slightly as she traced the edge of it. She didn't know what she felt. Anger, embarrassment, maybe envy. Her father, the man she'd treated like a fragile burden, had become a symbol of everything she wasn't. Brave, admired, unafraid. Grace looked up from her cereal. People are posting nice comments about him. They call him the Paris professor. Laura's eyes flicked up. How do you know that? Grace shrugged. I looked it up. Laura opened her laptop and typed Franklin Wells Paris into the search bar. The results were immediate. A dozen reposts, hundreds of comments, words like inspiring, hopeful, beautiful. She scrolled, each word twisting deeper. Someone had written, "Wish my dad had that kind of courage." Laura's throat tightened. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Frank had no idea any of it existed. He and Irene sat by the river that evening, the glow of the Eiffel Tower shimmering across the water. Paris moved around them like a slow waltz. Laughter, distant music, the rhythm of footsteps on cobblestones. Frank pulled out a postcard, its front a sketch of the Pont Neuf under moonlight. His handwriting, though careful, wavered slightly. Paris isn't lonely when you carry memories. He looked at it for a long time before writing the address. Not Laura's, Grace's. The next week, Grace opened the mailbox to find the postcard waiting, the faint scent of cologne and foreign air clinging to it. She ran her fingers over his familiar script, tears filling her eyes before she even finished reading. Paris isn't lonely when you carry memories. She smiled through the tears. That night, she taped it above her desk, beside the printed photo of him and Irene. Her mother passed by the doorway, pausing when she saw it. Their eyes met, one filled with pride, the other with quiet shame. Neither spoke. In Paris, the lights flickered on again as Frank lifted his glass toward Irene, the city humming with quiet life. He didn't know he'd become a symbol. He didn't care. He had finally stopped running from what was gone and started living for what remained. The waiting area of the bank was too quiet, the kind of silence that made Laura's nerves hum. Her nails tapped against the armrest of the leather chair as she stared at the frosted glass door marked Private Client Services. Inside, she could hear murmurs, the low professional tone of people, handling money that didn't belong to them, or, in this case, money that no longer belonged to her. When the door opened, the banker, a neatly dressed woman in her 50s, smiled politely. "Mrs. Nolan, you can come in now." Laura rose, spine straight, voice tight. "Good. I'd like to understand what exactly my father has done." Inside, the office was sleek and cold, sunlight reflecting off polished surfaces. The banker gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Please, have a seat." "I'll stand," Laura replied. The banker hesitated, then opened a file. "Your father, Mr. Franklin Wells, recently transferred his personal funds into a private travel trust. He's the sole trustee and beneficiary. It's fully independent." Laura's jaw clenched. "Independent?" "Yes. Meaning no one else can access or modify it. Not family members, not power of attorney, not even co-signers." Laura's voice rose. "I was the co-signer." The banker nodded gently. "Not anymore. The trust supersedes that authority. He filed it with an attorney 2 weeks before his departure." 2 weeks. He'd planned this, quietly, completely. Laura's hands tightened into fists. So you're telling me he can just move everything without consulting me? The banker folded her hands. It's his legal right. He's of sound mind, fully capable of managing his own finances. The paperwork is airtight. Laura's voice broke through the professionalism like glass shattering. He's being reckless. He's in another country, for God's sake, and you people are enabling him. The banker didn't flinch. Mrs. Nolan, your father's documents are meticulous. There's nothing reckless about them. He knew exactly what he was doing. Laura's face flushed, half rage, half humiliation. He's 70. You think he understands international finance? He's probably being manipulated. The banker gave a small, almost pitying smile. If anything, ma'am, I'd say he's finally taken control of his own life. That sentence hit like a slap. Laura leaned over the desk, voice trembling. You don't understand. He's my father. I was just trying to protect him. From what? The banker asked softly. Laura froze. The silence stretched long enough for the truth to sting. She didn't answer. When she got home, the fury hadn't cooled. It simmered beneath her skin like static electricity. The front door slammed behind her, and Grace jumped from the couch, startled. Mom? Laura stormed into the kitchen, dropping her purse with a thud. He moved everything, every cent. The bank says I have no access anymore. Grace followed her cautiously. You mean Grandpa? Yes, Laura snapped. He's being irresponsible. What if something happens to him over there? What if he needs help? He's throwing everything away. Grace's voice was calm but firm. No, Mom. He's living. The words landed heavy. Laura turned sharply. Living? You call this living? Running away? Cutting off his own family? He didn't cut us off, Grace said, stepping closer. You pushed him out. You treated him like he couldn't think for himself. And now he's showing you he can. Laura's hands slammed against the table, the sound echoing through the house. Enough, she shouted. Grace didn't flinch. Her eyes shimmered with emotion. He's happy, Mom. For once, he's not scared or small. Why can't you just let him have that? Laura opened her mouth but couldn't speak. Her breath came uneven, the realization sitting just behind her anger, that maybe, deep down, she wasn't furious because he'd left. She was furious because he'd stopped needing her. The phone on the counter rang, cutting through the silence. Frank's name glowed on the screen. Grace looked at her mother. Are you going to answer? Laura swallowed, then pressed accept. Dad? Frank's voice came through calm, measured, touched with the faint hum of background music and distant conversation. Laura. Her voice cracked. What are you doing? You can't just... He cut her off gently. Paris suits me. She went quiet. He let the pause linger, his tone polite but distant. You'd hate it here, he added softly. Too unpredictable. Dad, But before she could finish, the line clicked. The silence that followed wasn't the same kind she was used to. It wasn't neglect or dismissal. It was finality. Grace reached for the phone, reading the blank screen. He hung up. Laura nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. Grace looked at her mother, the woman who always had the last word, sitting speechless for the first time. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, rattling faintly like distant applause. The train ride south from Paris was quiet, golden fields rolling past the window like painted strokes. Frank watched them drift by, the rhythm of the rails matching the slower pulse of his thoughts. Across from him, Irene sipped tea from a paper cup, reading aloud from a French travel guide. They say the Bordeaux countryside has the best sunsets in Europe, she said. Frank smiled faintly. After 70 years, I think I'm ready to see a good one. The vineyard sat on a gentle hillside, just outside Saint-Emilion. Acres of green rose stretching to the horizon, the air thick with the scent of grapes and earth. The owner, a cheerful man in his 40s, greeted them like old friends. Monsieur Wells, we heard you used to teach poetry. Frank nodded modestly. A lifetime ago. Then perhaps you'll read something for our guests tonight, the man said with a wink. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Frank stood on a small wooden stage in the courtyard, surrounded by the soft murmur of travelers and the clinking of glasses. Lanterns swayed overhead, their light flickering across faces both young and old. He held a folded page of his own writing, something he'd penned the night before on the train. His voice was calm, deepened by time, but still sure. The older I get, he read, the less I chase what's fleeting. I seek only what stays. Laughter, kindness, a hand reaching across the table when words fall short. A quiet settled over the crowd. Irene watched from a nearby chair, her expression warm, proud. When he finished, the audience applauded softly, not out of politeness but out of connection. Frank bowed his head slightly, humbled. Later, they sat with glasses of red wine, the air cool and fragrant. You always had a way with words, Irene said. Frank chuckled. I had a lifetime to practice silence. Poetry's just what comes after. His phone buzzed on the table, an email notification. He almost ignored it, then saw the sender's name, Grace Wells. He opened it slowly. Grandpa, I saw your picture online again. You and Ms. Irene at that cafe. You look happy. Can I visit someday? Frank read it twice, his chest tightening with something between pride and longing. He smiled, setting the phone down. She wants to come here, he murmured. Irene's eyes softened. Will you let her? Of course, he said. But I'll make it special. She deserves the kind of welcome her mother never gave anyone. She laughed lightly. So, a surprise then? He raised his glass. A good one. While Paris glowed in serenity, back in Pennsylvania, Laura's world was beginning to unravel. The real estate market had turned against her. 2 deals fell through in the same week. A third client pulled out entirely. Her phone buzzed with unpaid invoices and urgent reminders. The pressure was relentless. At the kitchen table, stacks of bills surrounded her like judgment. Eric sat across from her, face pale. The bank called again, he said quietly. They're freezing the secondary account. Laura didn't look up. We'll fix it. With what? His voice carried no malice, only exhaustion. You burned through the savings. The commissions aren't enough. You need to face it. We're running out of money. She shot him a glare. Don't you dare put this on me. Eric rubbed his temples. I'm not. I'm just saying, maybe we call him. Her eyes hardened. No. Laura, think rationally. He has money now, a lot of it. He could help us if you just... If I what? She cut in. Beg after everything? Eric's silence was answer enough. She pushed back from the table, pacing. The pride that had once given her control now felt like a chain tightening around her chest. You think he'd even answer my call after what I did? Eric sighed. Maybe not, but he's still your father, and we're still family. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant tick of the kitchen clock. Laura sank into the chair again, shoulders slumped. I can't, she whispered. I can't let him see me like this. Eric watched her quietly. Then you'd better start learning humility before life teaches it for you. Her eyes flickered with anger, then defeat. Slowly, she reached for her phone, staring at her father's contact name. Her thumb hovered over the call button, shaking slightly. She didn't press it, not yet. Across the ocean, Frank and Irene walked through the vineyard rows under the stars, their laughter soft against the night air. The scent of grapes and soil mixed with the faint strains of violin music drifting from the courtyard. Frank looked out across the darkened valley, the horizon painted with the last streaks of sunset. Funny thing, he said quietly. When you stop chasing what you lost, you start finding what matters. Irene smiled. And what's that? Peace, he said simply. And a good bottle of wine. They clinked glasses. In his pocket, his phone buzzed again. An unread notification. The faint echo of something waiting back home. Laura's name. He glanced at it, unread, and slid it back into his coat. The tables had turned. The vineyard was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that feels earned. Cicadas hummed softly in the distance, and the air was warm with the scent of grapes and rain. Frank sat on the terrace with a glass of red wine, watching the last of the sunset bleed into the hills. Irene sat across from him, legs crossed, reading from a small paperback of Rilke. "Listen to this," she said, "and now we welcome the new year, full of things that have never been." Frank smiled faintly. "I like that, though I think my new year started the moment I left the ground." Irene looked over her glass at him. "You sound lighter these days." "I am," he said. "For once, I don't owe anyone an explanation." The phone buzzed on the table between them. The screen glowed with a name he hadn't expected to see again so soon. Laura. Frank stared at it for a moment, then reached for it. Irene said nothing, only watched as he lifted the phone to his ear. "Hello?" "Dad." Her voice came too bright, too rehearsed. "How are you? I saw the pictures. The vineyard looks beautiful." Frank leaned back in his chair. "It is." "I've been meaning to call," Laura continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Things have just been crazy here. The market's awful. The office is chaos, but, seeing you enjoying yourself, it's made me think." He didn't respond. The silence on his end stretched, long enough for her to grow uneasy. "I was wondering," she said finally, "maybe when you're back we can plan something. A family trip, all of us together this time." Frank swirled his wine, watching the deep color catch the light. "A family trip," he repeated softly, as though tasting the idea. "Yes," she said quickly. "Grace would love it, and Eric's, too. We could go somewhere close. Maybe not Paris, but—" He interrupted, his voice calm but sharp enough to stop her. "I already did." There was confusion in her pause. "Did what?" "Planned something," he said. "You just weren't invited." The line went silent. For a moment, Frank could hear nothing but the faint hiss of static and her unsteady breathing on the other end. "Dad, that's cruel," she whispered finally. "No," he said softly. "Cruel was taking a man's choices and calling it love." Laura's voice trembled. "I was trying to help you." "Help doesn't come with strings," he said, the calm in his tone making the words hit harder. "You didn't want to help, Laura. You wanted control, and now you've lost both." She tried again, her words faltering. I just thought we could start over." Frank looked at the vineyard stretching before him, the rows of vines catching the last bits of sun. "I already have." There was no anger in his voice, no triumph, just truth. The sound on the other end grew faint. Then, the smallest click. He ended the call. For a long moment, the night was utterly still. The air hummed with quiet finality. Irene set her book aside and lifted her glass. "To clean exits," she said, a small, knowing smile on her lips. Frank raised his glass in return. "Two earned ones." Their glasses touched gently, the sound soft as a closing door. The moon was rising now, pale and perfect above the vineyards. Frank exhaled slowly, the tension he hadn't realized he was still carrying slipping from his shoulders. Somewhere deep inside, a door had shut, but it didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like peace, long overdue. Irene studied him for a moment. "Do you think she'll ever understand?" Frank took another sip, his eyes on the stars just beginning to appear. "Maybe one day," he said. But understanding was never her goal. Control was. Irene smiled faintly. "And now?" He set the empty glass down, the reflection of the sky rippling in the wine. "Now, she'll have to learn how to live without it." In the distance, a soft wind moved through the vines, steady, unbothered, like the life he'd finally reclaimed. The morning light in Paris came soft and golden through the hotel window, spilling across the desk where Frank sat reading his emails. The quiet hum of the city filtered in, distant traffic, clinking cafe cups, laughter rising from the street below. It was a peace he had earned, and he guarded it like something sacred. At the top of his inbox sat a new message from Eric Nolan. The subject line read, "A fresh start." Frank clicked it open, already feeling the shape of the words before he saw them. Frank, I know things have been tense between all of us, but I think it's time to move forward. No more grudges, no more misunderstandings. Laura and I were thinking, maybe next year we could plan a joint family trip. Something small. All of us together, like before. Let's heal the family. What do you say? Eric. Frank stared at the email for a long time, lips curling into a faint, almost sad smile. Like before. The phrase echoed in his mind, a reminder of what before had cost him. His freedom, his trust, his dignity. He took a slow sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding him, and clicked forward. In the to field, he typed Irene Porter. The message he added beneath the original was short and clean, just one line. He still doesn't get it. He hit send, then closed the laptop. Later that afternoon, he and Irene walked through the quiet streets toward the left bank, the autumn air crisp with the scent of bread and rain. They were heading to a small bookstore that hosted local readings, Les Mots Perdus. The owner had invited Frank after hearing him speak at the vineyard. The shop was cozy, filled with the soft rustle of pages and the smell of ink. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle, an audience of perhaps 20, travelers, locals, and a few university students clutching notebooks. Frank stood at the front, one hand resting on a lectern. He looked out at the faces waiting for him to begin. He unfolded a piece of paper, a new poem, one written quietly in his hotel room the night before. His voice carried low but steady. Aging isn't about fading. It's about distilling, about keeping only what was worth carrying all along, the truth, the laughter, the names that didn't leave you. The words filled the small space like sunlight through a window. Irene watched from the front row, smiling softly, her eyes shining. When he finished, there was a pause, the kind that meant people were still inside the feeling. Then came applause, gentle but genuine. A young woman near the back stood up. You make getting older sound peaceful, Frank smiled. It is, once you stop trying to prove you're young. Laughter rippled through the crowd, warm and unforced. For the first time in years, he wasn't someone's burden or cautionary tale. He was simply heard. Afterward, Irene linked her arm through his as they walked out into the cool Paris evening. You realize, she said, you're becoming a bit of a celebrity. He chuckled. If I am, it's only because I finally stopped asking for permission. Permission to what? She asked. To live. Miles away, back in Pennsylvania, Grace sat cross-legged on her bed, scrolling through her phone. A headline caught her eye. Local professor inspires with Paris poetry reading. She clicked, heart swelling as she saw the photo. Her grandfather, standing before a small audience, smiling with quiet confidence. The article quoted a line from his reading. We don't age out of dreams. We just trade speed for depth. Grace printed it, the paper curling warm from the printer. She clipped the article carefully and slid it into her journal between the pages where she, kept her drawings. One of Paris, one of the two of them sitting at the kitchen table long before everything broke. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the page. For the first time in months, she didn't feel torn between loyalty and truth. She felt proud of him, of herself, of the courage he'd found that somehow now belonged to her too. Downstairs, she could hear her mother moving through the house, still tense, still quiet. Grace looked toward the door but said nothing. Some things healed in silence. She closed the journal gently, her thumb brushing over the folded article inside. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the trees, carrying with it the first faint echo of something new. Not reconciliation, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. The house had grown quieter, but not in the peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that hummed beneath the surface, heavy and waiting to break. The coffee machine sputtered on the counter, the only sound in a kitchen that once hosted chatter and morning rushes. Now it just smelled like stale coffee and tension. Laura stood at the sink, staring out the window, watching leaves scatter across the lawn. She hadn't noticed the seasons changing. Somewhere between her father leaving and the bills piling up, autumn had slipped in without asking. From the living room came the muffled sound of Eric's voice, low at first, then sharp. I told you this would happen. Laura's shoulders stiffened. Don't start, she said, turning from the sink. Eric appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, exhaustion etched deep into his face. Start? Laura, this started the moment you decided to play puppet master with your father's life. You couldn't just leave him be. Her voice rose, brittle and defensive. I was trying to protect him. You know that. Protect him? Eric laughed bitterly. You stole from him. You lied to him. And now guess what? We're broke. We're fighting. And he's out there thriving in Paris while we're falling apart. Laura's face twisted with frustration. You think I don't know that? You think I don't see it every time I turn on my phone? Eric's tone hardened. Maybe you should stop blaming everyone else for your choices. Grace's door upstairs slammed, not out of rebellion, but out of exhaustion. She couldn't take it anymore. She sat cross-legged on her bed, sketchbook open, pencil moving quietly across the page. Her latest drawing was of the Eiffel Tower, not the cliché tourist version, but a view from the riverbank, the way her grandfather might have seen it. She added small figures beneath it, one of them clearly him, holding a coffee cup, the other a woman she imagined must be Irene. They looked happy, peaceful, the opposite of this house. Downstairs, the argument rolled on, louder now. You think I ruined everything, Laura said, pacing. But you were right there beside me. You wanted his money as much as I did. Eric's expression tightened. Don't twist this, Laura. I didn't ask you to forge his trust or humiliate him. I thought you were helping him, not playing God. Her voice cracked. You don't understand what it's like to watch your parent fall apart, to see them slip away into old age and make reckless decisions. He wasn't slipping, Eric interrupted, his tone sharp. He was standing up. You just didn't like what it looked like. Laura's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she looked smaller, the armor she always wore beginning to crack. Eric grabbed his keys from the counter, the sound echoing like punctuation. You ruined this family, Laura. Don't you walk away from me, she said, but her voice broke on the last word. He didn't stop. The front door opened, then shut with finality. The silence that followed wasn't calm. It was hollow, echoing. Laura stood there for a long moment, her reflection faint in the dark window, the sound of her own breathing too loud. Then it hit, the weight she'd been holding back for months. She sank into a chair, her body trembling, tears falling before she could stop them. The sobs came quietly at first, then harder, raw, and unguarded. The kind that came from somewhere deep, from years of pride, curdling into regret. Upstairs, Grace put her pencil down, hearing the faint sound of her mother crying. For a long time, she didn't move. Then she opened her door and crept down the stairs. Laura didn't notice her until Grace was standing beside her, the soft rustle of paper in her hands. She held out the drawing, Paris beneath a golden sky, her grandfather standing in the light. Laura looked at it through blurred eyes. You drew this? Grace nodded. It's where he is, where he's happy. Laura's voice cracked. I thought I was doing the right thing. Grace's voice was soft, trembling. Maybe you were, for a while, but you stopped listening. Laura reached out, touching her daughter's hand. It was warm, steady. I didn't mean to hurt him. I know, Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. But maybe it's not too late, Mom. Laura looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time, she didn't see rebellion or defiance. She saw truth and love and disappointment that was gentle, not cruel. The clock ticked softly in the background, filling the silence they didn't know how to break. Laura wiped her tears, staring again at the drawing. It might be too late, sweetheart, she whispered. Grace squeezed her hand. Then at least try. The house settled around them, creaking, quiet, cracked, but not beyond repair. Somewhere deep inside, something shifted. The faintest sound of resolve, fragile but alive. The morning mist hung low over Paris, softening the edges of the city, as if refusing to let go of him too easily. Frank stood at his hotel window, suitcase, packed by the door, the quiet hum of traffic below blending with the faraway toll of a church bell. 6 weeks had passed. 6 weeks of wine, art, sunlight, and silence that healed more than he'd realized was broken. Now, it was time. He checked the flight confirmation one last time, Paris to Philadelphia, non-stop. The decision hadn't come easily. A part of him wanted to stay forever, but another part, the quieter, steadier part, knew peace only mattered if you carried it home. Downstairs, Irene waited by the lobby doors, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. When she saw him, her eyes softened, though her smile carried the quiet acceptance of someone who understood goodbyes. "So," she said, "the professor heads back to his next chapter." He chuckled. "You make it sound so literary." "It is," she replied. "Every ending should be." They shared coffee one last time in the Courtyard Cafe, the same one where they'd spent hours talking about books, loss, and second chances. The waiter recognized them and brought 2 croissants without asking. "You know," Irene said, breaking hers in half, "you finally became the man you used to teach about, the one who said courage was simply refusing to shrink." Frank smiled, though emotion tightened his throat. "It took 70 years to listen to my own lessons." She reached across the table, touching his hand. Better late than never. The moment lingered, warm and wordless. When they stood, she hugged him, not the desperate kind, but one filled with respect, fondness, and the understanding that some connections don't need permanence to matter. "Go home," she said softly, "and don't let them take this peace away from you." He nodded, eyes glistening. "Thank you for reminding me who I was." At the airport, Frank moved through security with the ease of a man who no longer feared getting lost. His steps were slower, yes, but deliberate. Around him, the terminal buzzed with voices, hurried, impatient, young. He found his gate and sat near the window, watching planes taxi against the gray sky. Across from him, a young couple argued, their voices rising just enough to draw looks. The woman clutched a ticket. The man gestured angrily toward the counter. "You said you confirmed it," she snapped. "I did. They changed the gate last minute." Frank watched quietly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The scene was so achingly familiar. The chaos, the miscommunication, the stubbornness that comes when love tangles with pride. He remembered himself years ago, standing at another airport counter, Eleanor beside him, both trying to plan a trip they'd never take. How much time had he wasted believing there would always be another chance? Now, as the couple stormed off, he took a slow sip of water and whispered, "Be kind to each other. It goes faster than you think." When the boarding announcement came, he stood, tucking his worn passport into his coat. He glanced one last time out the window, Paris gleaming faintly in the distance, and smiled. "Merci," he whispered. The flight home was quiet. The hum of the engines lulled him into reflection, not sleep. He thought of Grace's email, of the pride in her words. He thought of Laura, her voice sharp in memory, but now softened by distance. He wasn't sure what awaited him in Pennsylvania. He only knew he'd face it differently this time. When the plane touched down, the jolt pulled him from thought. He watched the city unfold beneath the morning haze, familiar and foreign all at once. At arrivals, Laura waited near the sliding doors, her fingers twisting anxiously around the strap of her purse. She looked smaller than he remembered, not in size, but in spirit. When she spotted him, she straightened, forcing a smile that didn't quite hold. "Dad." He stopped a few feet away. "Laura." For a moment, neither moved. The noise of the airport filled the silence between them. Carts rolling, announcements echoing, the soft shuffle of travelers who didn't know this was a battleground of history and forgiveness. "You look, well," she said finally. "I am," he answered simply. There was relief in her face, and something else, fear, maybe shame. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. He studied her, the daughter who had once spoken for him, over him, against him. There was fragility there now, cracks visible where arrogance had lived before. "Let's get some air first," he said, walking past her toward the doors. She followed, uncertain but hopeful. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of autumn rain. Frank inhaled deeply. He was home. Not the same man who'd left, not the man she'd tried to cage. The taxi pulled up, the driver loading his suitcase into the trunk. Laura hesitated beside him. "Dad, I just want things to be okay again." He looked at her, eyes calm but unreadable, then stopped trying to control what that means. She nodded, blinking back tears. Frank turned toward the cab, holding the door open but not yet stepping in. The space between them felt fragile, like glass catching the light. "Come by tomorrow," he said finally. "We'll start there." Laura exhaled, not forgiveness, not yet, but the first breath toward it. Frank slid into the cab, the door closing softly behind him. Through the window, as the car pulled away, their eyes met one last time, past hurt, past pride, both searching for something still unnamed. The same kitchen, the same table. But nothing about this morning felt the same. The air was heavy with unspoken words, the kind that had been waiting for too long to be said. Frank sat across from Laura, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. She hadn't taken a sip of hers. The light through the blinds cast narrow stripes across the table, dividing them, just like the years had. They had been sitting like this for nearly 10 minutes, the silence between them thicker than any argument they'd ever had. Laura finally exhaled, shaky and uneven. "I don't even know where to start." "Then start simple," Frank said quietly. She looked up, eyes rimmed with fatigue. "You shouldn't even be here, not after everything I did." Frank's voice was calm, but it carried a weight that made her shrink slightly. "And yet, here we are." She swallowed hard, her hands fidgeting in her lap. The words came out in a rush, part confession, part collapse. "I treated you like a child, Dad." The sentence hung there, raw and trembling. Frank didn't answer right away. He set his cup down slowly, the porcelain clinking softly against the wood. Then he looked at her, really looked at her. His voice was steady, quiet, and devastating in its truth. "Because you forgot I raised one." Laura's breath caught. For a moment, she looked like she might speak, but nothing came. The line cut through her armor, not cruelly, but cleanly. Across the room, Grace stood in the doorway, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but something in the air had pulled her there, the rare quiet of a reckoning. Laura's face broke, years of tension and pride crumbling at once. She covered her mouth, a sob slipping through her fingers. "I thought I was helping, I really did. You seemed so lost after Mom." Frank's eyes softened. "I was, but I still knew who I was." She nodded through the tears, her voice barely a whisper. "I was scared of losing you." He leaned back slightly. "And in trying to stop that, you did anyway." The truth of it landed, unflinching but necessary. For a long moment, there was only the sound of Grace's pencil scraping faintly against the edge of her sketchbook, a nervous habit when emotions got too big. She looked down, sketching quietly to steady herself. Frank noticed her and smiled gently. "You don't have to hide, sweetheart. Come sit." Grace hesitated, then crossed the room and slid into the chair beside her grandfather. Her sketchbook lay open, a drawing of the three of them at this very table, though she hadn't realized she'd drawn it that way. Laura glanced at it, her tears softening. "You're always watching us," she said quietly. Grace shrugged, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "Someone has to remember how it really looked." Frank chuckled softly, not with amusement, but gratitude. He reached for her hand, then turned to Laura. "I'm not angry anymore," he said. "Not really." Laura wiped her eyes, voice trembling. "Then, do you forgive me?" He looked down for a moment, then back at her. His answer came slow, deliberate, and honest. "Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's learning." Laura nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "Then I want to learn." "Good," he said, a faint smile returning, "because we've all got something left to learn." Grace watched them, two people who had spent a lifetime misunderstanding each other, finally finding the same language. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The light shifted as a cloud passed outside, brightening the room just slightly. The air felt different now, still fragile, still tender, but no longer brittle. Laura reached across the table. Her hand trembled as she placed it over his. "Thank you," she whispered. Frank nodded once, slow and sure. They sat like that, 3 generations bound by silence, by regret, by something that might, someday, become peace. Outside, wind rustled through the trees, the faint sound of birds returning to the yard. The cracks in the family hadn't vanished, but for the first time, something was growing in them, fragile, alive, and trying. The air inside the lawyer's office was calm, almost sterile. Polished mahogany, the faint scent of leather, and the quiet tick of a grandfather clock, marking time as if it mattered more here than anywhere else. Frank sat at the head of a long table, his posture straight, his hands folded neatly in front of him. To his left sat Grace, her sketchbook balanced on her lap. Across from them, Laura fidgeted in her chair, pretending calm but unable to hide the tension in her jaw. She hadn't wanted to come, but curiosity and guilt had pulled her here. At the far end of the table, a stack of documents waited beneath the lawyer's careful hands. Beside him sat Irene, calm and composed, a silent witness. She had insisted on being there, not as part of the business, but as moral ballast, the reminder of how far Frank had come. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Wells, as per your request, we'll begin with the reading of the trust amendment." Laura's stomach tightened. "Amendment?" Frank nodded slowly. "I made some changes while I was in Paris. Thought it was time to put things in proper order." The lawyer cleared his throat. "This document outlines the establishment of the Eleanor Wells Paris Fund, an educational and travel trust in memory of Mr. Wells's late wife. The beneficiary," he paused, glancing up briefly, "is Miss Grace Wells." Grace blinked. "Me?" The lawyer smiled kindly. "Yes, you and you alone?" Laura's eyes snapped toward her father. "Wait, what?" Frank didn't look at her right away. He turned to Grace, his expression soft. "It's yours, sweetheart. Every dollar that was once meant for that trip, and more. You can use it when you turn 21, for school, for travel, for whatever takes you further." Grace sat speechless, eyes darting between him and her mother. "Grandpa, I don't know what to say." He smiled. "Then just listen." Laura leaned forward, voice shaking. "Dad, what about the rest? The house, the accounts? You can't just—" "I can," Frank interrupted, his tone calm but unyielding. "And I did." She stared at him, disbelief curdling into quiet panic. "You're cutting me out." He met her eyes now, steady and clear. "No, Laura, you did that yourself." The lawyer stayed silent, wisely so, letting the family's words fill the air. Laura's voice grew sharp, the cracks showing. "I made mistakes, yes, but this is punishment." "It's not punishment," Frank said evenly. "It's perspective." Irene, who had remained quiet until now, spoke softly. "You raised a daughter who forgot what was hers to keep and what was never hers to take." Laura turned toward her, defensiveness flaring. "You don't get to judge me." "I'm not," Irene replied gently. "I'm witnessing the moment you get to start over." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Frank leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now, the authority replaced by something gentler. "Laura, this isn't about revenge. It's about legacy. You were so busy protecting what you thought was yours. You forgot what really mattered. Grace didn't." He turned toward his granddaughter, eyes softening. "You earned this through honesty, through kindness. You never asked for it. That's why it belongs to you." Grace's throat tightened. "Thank you, Grandpa." Laura sat back in her chair, her composure finally slipping. Her father's words were too calm to fight, too final to negotiate. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closing in around her pride. "You built all of this," she said bitterly. "And now you're just giving it away?" Frank took a slow breath. "No, I'm giving it forward." The lawyer began collecting the documents, sliding the signed pages neatly into a folder. "Everything will be finalized by week's end," he said quietly. Laura nodded stiffly, her gaze falling to the polished table where her reflection trembled in the sheen. She saw herself clearly now, not as the caretaker she once imagined, but as someone who'd confused control for love. Frank stood, smoothing his jacket. Irene followed. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. Grace rose too, holding her sketchbook close, the faintest smile on her face, not out of triumph, but out of peace. Laura remained seated, her eyes glistening. "Dad," she began, but her voice faltered. He looked at her one last time, his tone measured, his expression kind. "It's never too late to learn, Laura, but the lesson's yours now." He turned to Irene, who gave him a small nod. Approval, quiet and knowing. As they walked toward the door, the late afternoon light poured through the window, cutting across the table between father and daughter. It wasn't a wall anymore. It was a line. On one side, loss. On the other, grace. The sound of drawers slamming echoed through the house like gunfire. Eric moved through the hallway, grabbing clothes, chargers, and whatever else fit into the suitcase half-zipped on the bed. His movements were sharp, frantic, the physical rhythm of a man running from failure. Laura stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her voice low but trembling. "You're not even going to talk about this?" Eric didn't look up. "What's left to talk about, Laura? The investments are gone, the clients pulled out, the credit's shot. I'm done cleaning up after your mess." "My mess?" she snapped. "You were the one who pushed for those deals. You wanted the bigger house, the car." He cut her off. "I wanted stability. You wanted control." The silence that followed hit harder than the words. Grace stood on the stairs, unseen, her hand gripping the railing. She'd learned to stay quiet during these fights, but this one felt different. It wasn't fire this time. It was collapse. Eric shoved the last of his clothes into the suitcase. "You don't get it, do you? You burned every bridge you had with your father, your clients, your reputation. And for what? Pride?" Laura's voice cracked. "I was trying to hold this family together." He zipped the suitcase closed, finally meeting her eyes. "No, Laura, you were trying to hold control. The family didn't survive that." Her lips parted, but nothing came out. He walked past her, the wheels of his luggage thudding softly on the wood floor. Grace turned her face away as he passed, but he didn't look up. The front door opened, hesitated, then shut with finality. The house exhaled, empty, echoing. Laura stood in the middle of the living room, her body stiff, her expression blank. For once, she didn't cry. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind only silence. Grace came down the stairs slowly, holding her sketchbook against her chest. "He's gone." Laura nodded, her voice barely audible. "He's gone." Grace hesitated, then said quietly, "Maybe it's better this way." Laura turned toward her, startled. "Better?" Grace met her mother's gaze, steady and unflinching. "Sometimes people leave so you can see what's still worth staying for." Laura looked away, her throat tightening. She wasn't sure whether her daughter was comforting her or teaching her. That night, the house felt cavernous. The ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, every small sound echoed against the emptiness Eric had left behind. Laura sat at the kitchen table, the same place where she'd once mocked her father, the same place where she'd broken down months ago. This time, she wasn't angry. She was just still. A soft knock broke the silence. When she opened the door, Frank stood there, his face lit gently by the porch light. He looked older, but calm, the kind of calm that came from surviving storms. "I heard," he said simply. Laura nodded, eyes glistening. "I didn't ask him to go." "I know," Frank said. "Sometimes people don't have to be pushed. They just reach their limit." She looked down, ashamed. "I don't know how to fix any of this." Frank stepped inside, glancing around at the bare counters, the unopened mail, the quiet despair that clung to the air. "You start with truth," he said. "Not money, not excuses. Truth." Laura sank into a chair, her voice breaking. "I don't have anything left." Frank pulled out a chair across from her. Then you're finally ready. Grace peeked from the hallway, watching them. The old man who'd once been patronized, now sitting steady, grounded, patient. Her mother, stripped of pride, but not hope. Frank's voice softened. You can rebuild from truth, Laura. It's slower, but it lasts. For the first time, she didn't argue. She didn't justify or deflect. She simply nodded. I'll try, she said. He smiled faintly. That's more than I ever expected. Grace stepped into the light, sliding her sketchbook onto the table. Then maybe we can all start over. Frank reached out, placing his hand gently over both of theirs. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was the sound of something beginning. Redemption didn't need applause. It just needed space to breathe. The town hall had never looked so elegant. White banners hung from the ceiling, soft piano music filled the air, and the smell of fresh flowers drifted through the crowd. A simple sign stood by the stage, the Eleanor Wells Paris Scholarship, because dreams don't expire. Frank stood near the podium, his suit pressed, his tie slightly uneven. Grace had helped him fix it earlier that morning. The audience buzzed with quiet admiration. Reporters from the local paper, teachers, and a few curious townspeople had gathered, drawn by the story that had spread far beyond Pennsylvania. An article had called him the man who proved dreams don't expire. He hadn't liked the title at first. It sounded too grand, too cinematic. But as he looked around the room, at the people his story had touched, he realized it wasn't about him at all. It was about permission, the permission to start again, no matter when. He stepped up to the microphone, adjusted it slightly, and looked out at the faces before him. When my wife, Eleanor, and I were young, we planned a trip to Paris, he began, his voice calm and steady. But life got in the way. Work, bills, excuses, and someday kept getting postponed. After she passed, I told myself I was too old for that dream. I was wrong. A soft murmur moved through the room, part emotion, part respect. This scholarship, he continued, is for anyone who's ever said someday and meant never. It's for those who still have a story to write, even if the first chapters are already behind them. Applause swelled, gentle, heartfelt. Frank stepped back, nodding to Grace, who was waiting at the edge of the stage with a small stack of note cards. She was trembling slightly, but smiling. Next, Frank said, my granddaughter, Grace Wells, will say a few words. She walked up slowly, the sound of her shoes light against the polished floor. When she reached the microphone, she took a deep breath and looked at her grandfather. He told me once that courage doesn't always look like fighting, she began. Sometimes it looks like getting on a plane you were told you couldn't handle. Laughter rippled softly through the room. He taught me that dreams aren't limited by age, only by fear. And that family isn't about control, it's about faith. This scholarship isn't just about travel, it's about believing that there's still more life left to live. Her voice wavered slightly at the end, and Frank's eyes glistened. When she stepped away from the podium, he hugged her, the kind of embrace that said everything words couldn't. In the back of the room, Laura stood quietly, half hidden behind a fee column. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. She didn't want to take attention from him, not this time. She wore a simple black dress, her hair tied back. Her eyes never left her father. When the applause rose again, she clapped too, her hands trembling. Tears blurred her vision as she watched Grace smile, watched Frank laugh, watched the two of them shine together. Every clap was an echo of what she'd almost destroyed. When the ceremony ended, people gathered around Frank to shake his hand, to thank him. Laura stayed back, watching as the reporters surrounded him, snapping photos, asking questions. How does it feel to inspire so many? What advice would you give your younger self? He answered them with the same quiet grace that had become his trademark. I'd tell him that it's never too late to do the right thing, he said. That line made its way into every article the next day. As the crowd began to thin, Laura finally stepped forward. She didn't speak to him, not yet. She just stood near the edge of the room, looking at the banner with her mother's name on it, Eleanor Wells. For a long time, she just stared, her eyes wet. Then she whispered to herself, You'd be proud of him, Mom. On stage, Frank turned slightly, as if sensing her presence. Their eyes met, distant but connected. No anger left, no resentment, just the quiet understanding that forgiveness had already begun its work. He gave a small nod. She returned it. It wasn't reconciliation, not fully, but it was enough. As the lights dimmed and the crowd drifted out into the cool evening air, Frank looked up at the banner one last time. Dreams don't expire. He smiled. No, he murmured, they just wait. The living room smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paper, the kind of scent that lingered after a slow afternoon of coffee and stories. Frank sat in his armchair by the window, a small record player spinning quietly nearby. The soft sound of a French cafe melody filled the room, the same kind that had once played through Paris streets as he sipped wine under the Eiffel Tower. He leaned back, eyes half closed, a gentle smile on his face. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel lonely. It felt lived in. It felt his again. Grace entered quietly, her footsteps light on the wood floor. She was carrying something, a small rectangular frame wrapped in brown paper. "Grandpa," she said softly. Frank opened his eyes, turning toward her. "Hey, sweetheart, you look like you've been up to something." She smiled. "Kind of." He motioned for her to sit, and she took the seat across from him, holding the frame carefully in her lap. "I wanted to give you something." He raised an eyebrow. "Shouldn't I be the one giving you gifts? You've been the best part of this whole story." Grace shook her head, smiling shyly. "Not this time." She handed him the wrapped frame. Frank's fingers were still steady as he peeled away the paper. When he saw what lay beneath the glass, his breath caught. It was the postcard, the one he'd written from Paris, the one that read in his own handwriting, "Paris isn't lonely when you carry memories." Grace had framed it with care. The edges of the postcard were slightly yellowed, the ink faint, but still clear. Beneath it, she had written in her own neat script, "Now it's part of mine." Frank stared at it for a long time, the quiet ticking of the clock marking the moment. His throat tightened, his voice barely a whisper. "You kept this all this time?" Grace nodded. "I got it before Mom ever did. I didn't tell her at first. I think I just needed to keep something that was only ours." Frank's eyes glistened. He blinked slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea how much this means to me." "I think I do," Grace said softly. "It's not just about Paris, Grandpa. It's about you. About everything you taught me, even when you didn't mean to." Frank chuckled, a low, heartfelt sound. "And what lesson was that?" "That courage doesn't have an age limit." He laughed, the sound full and genuine, echoing through the room. "You really are your mother's daughter, when she remembers to listen." Grace smiled. "She's getting there." The record switched to a slower tune, the soft hum of an accordion weaving through the space. Frank set the framed postcard down on the side table, his hand resting on it for a moment longer, as if grounding himself in its truth. "I used to think that message was for Eleanor," he said, his gaze drifting toward the photo of his late wife on the mantel. "But maybe it was for you too." Grace leaned forward, her voice tender. "Then we both heard it." From the doorway, unseen at first, Laura stood watching them. Her hands were folded loosely in front of her, her eyes wet but calm. She didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The sight before her, her father and her daughter, framed by the soft light of afternoon, laughter spilling between them, was worth more than anything she'd ever tried to control. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider in her own home. She felt forgiven, even if no one had said it aloud. Frank noticed her then. Their eyes met. He didn't say anything, just gave a small nod, the kind that carried decades of understanding. Laura smiled faintly, a quiet exhale escaping her lips. Grace followed his gaze and turned to see her mother. "Hey, Mom," she said softly. "Come see." Laura walked over, her steps hesitant but steady. When she saw the postcard, her lips parted in surprise. "I remember that one," she murmured. "You sent it right after." Her voice trailed off, the memory filling in the rest. Frank nodded gently, It found its way home. Laura looked at Grace's handwriting beneath his. Now it's part of mine. Her chest tightened, but not with pain, with something warmer. Renewal. The three of them sat together as the music played, the light shifting across the floor like time itself slowing to watch. No one spoke for a while. They didn't need to. The silence was soft now. Not a wall, but a bridge. Frank reached for his cup, raising it slightly toward the window. "To Paris," he said quietly. Grace grinned. "To memories," Laura added, barely above a whisper, "and to new ones." Outside, the evening sun poured golden light across the table, catching the edge of the framed postcard, a single line shining brighter than the rest. "Paris isn't lonely when you carry memories." Frank smiled, his voice tender as he said, "And I don't think I ever will be. Again." The cafe in New York was small and tucked between two brownstones, the kind of place where time seemed to pause the moment you stepped inside. The light was soft, the chatter low, and a jazz record hummed faintly in the background. The city's heartbeat, slowed down just enough to feel human. Frank sat near the window, a half-finished cup of tea beside him, watching people hurry past outside. The skyline loomed like an old memory, tall, restless, and unyielding. He'd flown in that morning for a university event honoring retired faculty, but the real reason he'd come sat across the table from him now. Irene Porter looked just as she had in Paris, graceful, composed, eyes sharp with humor and history. She stirred her coffee absently, smiling at him. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me, Professor Wells." Frank chuckled, the sound easy and warm. "Forget about you? I don't think Paris would let me." She lifted her cup. "Nor New York, apparently. You always did know how to find me." They clinked cups, not as lovers or long-lost friends, but as two travelers meeting at the same crossroad one last time. There was no tension now, no unfinished business, just quiet recognition of what they had shared and what they had both let be. Outside, the rain began to fall, light, steady, rhythmic. It tapped gently against the window, the sound mingling with the soft piano drifting from the cafe speakers. "So," Irene said, leaning back, "how does it feel to be, well, whatever it is you are now? Free, famous, forgiven?" Frank smiled, shaking his head. "Old, mostly." She laughed, that same clear, unaffected laugh that had once turned heads at Paris cafes. "You're not old, Frank. You're just seasoned, like good wine." He raised an eyebrow. "And what does that make you?" "Probably the cork," she teased, still keeping everything from spilling out. They both laughed, the sound full and familiar. When it faded, a softer tone took its place, something like reverence. Irene reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "I brought you something." He opened it carefully. Inside was a single photograph, the two of them at the vineyard in Bordeaux. He was reading from his notebook. She was laughing beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The sunlight caught her hair just right. "I found it on my camera," she said. "Thought you might want proof it wasn't all a dream." Frank's eyes softened. "It wasn't, though sometimes it feels like it." "Good dreams usually do," she said. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of time between them measured not in years, but in moments. Then Irene lifted her glass of white wine. "To time," she said. Frank picked up his tea, smiling faintly. "To loss," he added. She tilted her head. "And freedom." Their glasses touched with a soft clink that seemed to echo longer than it should. "Have." She studied him for a long moment. "You won your story, you know." Frank shook his head slowly, smiling. "No, Irene. I just changed the ending." Her smile widened, gentle and knowing. "That's what writers do." He chuckled. "You always did make things sound poetic." "That's because you lived it like one." The record changed, the next track playing faintly, an old French tune, the kind that carried Paris in every note. For a moment, it was as if the walls disappeared, replaced by cobblestone streets, cafe tables, and the golden light of the city they'd both loved for different reasons. "I should get going," Irene said finally, glancing at her watch. "My train leaves soon." Frank nodded. Where to? Home, she said simply. Wherever that feels like today. He smiled at that. It's funny. I used to think home was a place. Now I think it's just the people who remind you of who you are. She stood, draping her shawl over her shoulders. Then I suppose we've both been home for a while now. He rose too, slower but steady. They didn't hug this time. They didn't need to. She leaned in, pressed a kiss to his cheek, and whispered, "Goodbye, Frank Wells." He nodded, his voice quiet but firm. Au revoir, Irene Porter. As she walked away, the bell above the cafe door chimed softly. The rain outside had stopped. Sunlight began to filter through the clouds, painting the city in soft gold. Frank sat back down, looking once more at the photograph in his hands. The music swelled, that faint echo of Paris, carrying him somewhere between memory and peace. He raised his glass one last time. "To the endings we earn," he murmured. The camera of the moment lingered, his reflection in the window, the music fading, before dissolving gently into silence, like closing a favorite book. The smell of fresh paint filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of wood and dust, the aroma of renewal. Afternoon light streamed through the windows of Frank's old house, scattering across the newly sanded floors and the bare walls now waiting for color. It had been years since the study had seen life. Once filled with papers, books, and ghosts of lectures long past, it had sat quiet, untouched, like a sealed memory. But now, ladders leaned against the walls, open cans of paint dotted the floor, and the faint hum of a radio played from the corner. Frank stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, brush in hand. He smiled faintly at the sight before him. Grace sat cross-legged on the drop cloth, splattered with paint, sketching something in her notebook, while Laura rolled paint along the far wall. The color, a soft, pale blue, caught the light just right. It felt calm, almost hopeful. "You missed a spot," Frank teased, pointing to a small patch near the baseboard. Laura shot him a look, but couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her. "You always were a perfectionist." "Occupational hazard," he said. She dipped the roller again, her strokes steady but thoughtful. There was no tension now, no edge, just a quiet rhythm of shared effort. They painted in companionable silence, a silence that no longer felt like avoidance, but healing. Grace looked up from her sketch. "Grandpa, is this really going to be my reading room?" Frank nodded. "Yours and whoever else wants to borrow it. But yes, I figured it's time someone gave these walls a new story." Her eyes lit up. "Can I put my art on the wall?" "Of course, as long as it doesn't cover the books." She grinned. "Deal." He watched her with quiet pride, feeling the strange symmetry of it all. Years ago, this room had been where he'd lost himself, where grief and loneliness had filled the air thicker than dust. Now, it was being painted over with laughter, with the sound of brushes tapping cans and the creak of the floor beneath new beginnings. On one of the shelves, still wrapped in protective paper, lay the old Paris scrapbook, the one he and Eleanor had made decades ago. He unwrapped it carefully, placing it in the center of the top shelf, pages open to a familiar spread. Paris, 1987. Someday. He brushed his fingers over the faded ink. The handwriting still made him smile. Eleanor's looping script, the small hearts she'd drawn beside the word someday. Grace noticed. "You still keep it open like that?" "Always," he said softly. "Some dreams are meant to stay in view." She studied him for a moment, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Will you ever go again?" He paused, meeting her gaze. A small smile tugged at his lips. "Maybe," he said, "but not alone next time." Her eyes softened. "Promise?" He chuckled. "Cross my heart." Behind them, Laura leaned on her roller, watching the exchange quietly. She hadn't said much since they'd started painting, but the sight of her father and daughter, their laughter easy, their affection unforced, brought a sting to her eyes. She cleared her throat. "You know," she said gently, "Mom would have loved this." Frank turned toward her, a slow smile forming. "I think she does." The words hung there, Simple, but full. Laura nodded, her lips pressing together as tears threatened to fall. She dipped the roller back into the tray, her voice unsteady. You always said healing takes time. I didn't realize it could take a lifetime. Frank walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. Sometimes it does, but time's the only thing that makes it real. She nodded, wiping her cheek with the back of her wrist, then went back to painting. Grace switched on the small desk lamp in the corner, testing the light. The warm glow spilled across the bookshelves, the paint still drying on the walls, and the scrapbook open like a window to another life. Frank stood in the center of the room, looking around, at his daughter, his granddaughter, and the echoes of the woman who had once filled this house with laughter. For the first time, it didn't feel like a place haunted by the past. It felt like a home again. Laura stepped back, studying the finished wall. It's beautiful, she said softly. Grace smiled, holding up her paint-splattered hands. It's not perfect. Frank chuckled. Good, neither are we. They laughed together, the sound warm and easy. Outside, the evening light turned golden, casting long shadows that reached across the room, gentle reminders of what had been lost and what had been found again. The Paris scrapbook caught a bit of that light, its pages glowing faintly under the lamp. Grace leaned her head against Frank's arm. You think Grandma would like it? He smiled, his eyes glimmering. She'd say it's about time. The three of them stood there a moment longer, surrounded by color, memory, and quiet peace, the kind that feels earned. The past had finally settled, but the story somehow didn't feel finished yet. The morning sun poured softly through the kitchen windows, casting long rectangles of light across the table. Frank sat there, glasses perched on the edge of his nose, a cup of coffee cooling beside the morning paper. Outside, the world was quiet, the kind of early peace only found in homes that had fought for it. He was sorting through the mail, bills, flyers, the usual, when one envelope caught his attention. It was white, crisp, with the faint blue and gold seal of an international courier in the corner. The handwriting across the front was unmistakable, Grace's. He turned it over once in his hands, smiling. Then with a small breath, he opened it. Inside was a folded letter, handwritten, and beneath it, a glossy piece of paper that slipped free and landed softly on the table. A college acceptance, École des Beaux-Arts de Paris. Frank's heart stilled. He blinked, reading the words twice, then again, as if the letters might rearrange into something less miraculous. But they didn't. It was real. He unfolded the letter next. Grandpa, I got in. Paris, just like we talked about. I can't believe it, and I can't wait to go, but I didn't want to tell you on the phone. I wanted you to hold this when you found out. Check the envelope again. There's something else inside. He frowned lightly, reaching back into the envelope. Another paper slid out, a small boarding pass printed and folded, not his, but a copy. At the top, in neat block letters, she'd written, Grandpa, I kept your seat reserved. Frank froze. Then, slowly, the breath he didn't know he'd been holding escaped as a laugh, half joy, half disbelief, breaking somewhere between tears and pride. His fingers trembled as he ran them across the edge of the boarding pass. He could almost hear her voice, that quiet mix of mischief and love that reminded him so much of her grandmother. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, and for a moment he could see it. Grace standing beneath the same Paris sky he once wandered, sketchbook in hand, eyes wide with wonder. The dream had come full circle. A soft sound behind him, the creak of a floorboard. Laura stood in the doorway, towel slung over her shoulder from drying dishes. What's that? She asked, noticing the open envelope. Frank turned toward her, his smile still damp with emotion. Mail from Grace. She walked closer, curious. When she saw the letterhead, École des Beaux-Arts, her eyes widened. No? She covered her mouth, tears already welling. She got in? He nodded, holding up the boarding pass. Not just that. She saved me a seat. Laura laughed softly through the tears, shaking her head. Of course she did. Frank chuckled, voice thick. She's got your fire, you know. Laura smiled, sitting beside him. And maybe your stubbornness. He tilted his head. That's dangerous combination. Or the perfect one, she replied. They sat there for a long moment, just looking at the acceptance letter and the boarding pass lying side by side, past and future, folded neatly together. Laura reached over, placing her hand on his. You did this, she said quietly. All of it. You gave her the courage to go. Frank shook his head gently. No, I just showed her it's never too late to start. She smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. For a long time, neither spoke. The clock ticked softly in the background, and the faint hum of life outside, distant birds, a car door closing, the whisper of wind, wrapped the moment in stillness. Finally, Frank stood, carrying the letter and the boarding pass to the shelf where the Paris scrapbook sat open. He placed them gently beside it. The postcard Grace had once framed still hung above the desk, its words softly echoing across time. Paris isn't lonely when you carry memories. Laura watched him, her expression calm. You know she's going to ask you to visit. I hope she does, he said with a grin, and maybe this time I'll let someone come with me. Laura laughed through her tears. Careful, old man. I might take you up on that. He turned to her, eyes warm. Then I'll make sure there are 2 seats waiting. The sunlight shifted across the wall, glinting off the glass frame that held the original boarding pass, the one that had once started everything. Frank looked at it, that simple slip of paper that had carried a lifetime of change, and whispered, almost to himself, funny how one ticket can rewrite everything. Laura smiled, following his gaze. The camera of memory would linger there, on the framed boarding pass, catching the morning light, on the Paris scrapbook beside it, on the quiet hum of peace, filling a house that had once been broken. The circle wasn't just complete, it was still turning, slowly, beautifully, endlessly. The airport was alive with the sound of movement, rolling suitcases, distant announcements, and the low hum of people chasing their destinations. The smell of coffee and jet fuel mixed in the air, familiar and exciting. Grace stood at the check-in counter, passport in hand, her sketchbook tucked under her arm. The airline attendant handed her a boarding pass with a warm smile. Have a wonderful flight to Paris, Miss Wells. Grace smiled back, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and awe. Thank you. A few feet away, Frank watched her with quiet pride. He was leaning slightly on his cane, but his eyes held the light of a man who'd already made this journey once, and somehow was making it again through her. Beside him, Laura stood with her arms crossed, not in defense this time, but to hold herself together. They followed Grace toward the security line, walking slowly, not wanting to reach the goodbye too soon. You packed your meds? Laura asked for the 5th time. Mom, Grace said with a soft laugh, I'm 18, not 80. Frank grinned. Careful, that's how it starts. You wake up one morning and realize you're giving the same lectures your parents did. Laura rolled her eyes, laughing. Don't give her ideas, Dad. The humor eased the tension, but beneath it, emotion lingered, tender, unspoken, heavy in the air. At the end of the security line, Grace turned to face them. Well, this is it. Frank nodded, his smile steady but his eyes glassy. You ready? She exhaled. Ready as I'll ever be. He stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. Then go live it, sweetheart. Don't just see Paris. Feel it. The light, the sound, the way it breathes. That city doesn't just sit still. It talks to you if you listen. Grace's eyes shimmered. I'll listen, Grandpa. Laura swallowed hard, reaching out to pull her daughter into a hug. I'm so proud of you, she whispered, more than I can ever say. Grace held her tighter. Thanks for letting me go. Laura's voice cracked. It was time. When they finally pulled apart, Frank reached into his coat pocket and handed Grace something small, a folded paper, worn from years of handling. She unfolded it and gasped. It was the original Paris 1987, someday scrapbook page. I think it belongs to you now, Frank said softly. Finish the story. Grace bit her lip, smiling through tears. I will. A boarding announcement echoed overhead. Flight 246 to Paris, now boarding at gate 12. Grace wiped her eyes, picked up her bag, and turned toward the gate. She hesitated once, looking back. Frank and Laura stood side by side, the past and future bound by forgiveness. "Love you," she called. "Love you more," Laura replied. Frank lifted a hand in a small wave, his smile peaceful. "Bon voyage, my girl." Grace smiled, then disappeared into the line, swallowed by the slow-moving crowd, beyond the glass partition. For a long moment, Frank and Laura stood there in silence, watching her move toward the metal detector, shoes off, passport clutched close like a ticket to destiny. When she finally turned the corner, gone from sight, Frank exhaled, a deep, steady breath that carried years of weight out of him. He leaned slightly closer to Laura, his voice a near whisper. "Different generation," he said, "same dream." Laura turned to him, her expression soft. "You gave her that dream." He smiled, shaking his head. "No, you gave it back yourself." The words lingered, settling between them like sunlight on the floor. Outside, through the wide airport window, the plane began to taxi down the runway. Frank watched as it picked up speed, steady, sure, unstoppable, until its nose lifted and it rose into the sky. For a moment, the reflection of the aircraft shimmered across the glass where Frank stood, aligning perfectly with his silhouette. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched, pride replacing the old ache that had once lived in his chest. "She did it," Laura said softly. He nodded. "We all did." The plane disappeared into the bright horizon, leaving only the echo of engines and a quiet that felt full, not empty. Closure, luminous, and earned. The first letter arrived 2 weeks after Grace's flight, a white envelope with elegant handwriting, the return address neatly marked, Paris, France. Frank found it in the mailbox one crisp morning, nestled between a few bills and a gardening catalog. He smiled the moment he saw her name. Inside was a folded page, carefully written, and a few printed photos. The first was of Grace standing near the Seine, her sketchbook open on her lap, sunlight glinting off the water. The second showed a small cafe table, 2 untouched croissants, and a steaming cup of coffee captioned, "Thought of you here." The letter began, "Dear Grandpa, Paris smells like fresh bread and rain. My professors are kind, and the studio windows face the river. I've made friends who paint all day and talk about life like it's a poem. I see now what you meant when you said the city breathes. It really does." Frank chuckled softly, reading the words aloud to himself. Every week, another letter came. And soon, the collection grew. Photos of museums, sketches of old bridges, the occasional story about strangers she met in cafes. Grace wrote with the warmth of someone not just living her dream, but sharing it with the people who had given her the courage to try. By the 3rd week, Frank had found a new ritual. Every Thursday afternoon, he carried Grace's latest letter to the town library, the same one where he'd once held literature discussions years ago. The library director, a kind woman named Marie, had invited him to read aloud to the senior group that met weekly in the back room. That afternoon, as the group gathered, 6 women and 3 men, all retired, all curious. Frank stood at the small podium, the latest envelope in hand. "Today," he said with a smile, "we're traveling to Paris." A soft murmur of excitement filled the room. He began to read. "Dear Grandpa, today I visited the same vineyard you wrote about years ago. They remembered you, or at least the poem you read. I told them you'd said peace comes in sips, not bottles. They laughed and agreed. I think they missed you." The room went silent, the kind of silence that listens. Frank continued, his voice steady but warm, weaving her words into the air. As he read, he noticed something beautiful, the faces before him softening, smiling, lost in her stories. When he finished, there was quiet applause, a few watery eyes, and one gentleman whispering to another, "Maybe it's not too late for us, eh?" The following week, 2 of the regulars brought in their old passports, joking about dusting them off. One woman, Margaret, shyly confessed she'd booked her first cruise. "Your granddaughter's letters," she said, "make the world feel smaller." Frank beamed. That's her gift. She makes faraway things feel close. As the weeks passed, the readings became something of an event. The town paper even covered it once. Local retiree reads, letters from Paris, inspiring others to travel. Frank pretended to grumble about the attention, but he secretly loved it. One rainy evening, as Laura helped tidy up after one of the sessions, she paused, hearing her father laugh across the room. It was a sound she hadn't heard in years, not polite laughter, but real, belly-deep joy. He was surrounded by people leaning in, listening, the world alive in his voice again. Laura stood there, watching him, her eyes soft. For so long, she'd seen him through the lens of fragility. Now, she saw him as he truly was. Strong, gentle, still teaching, just in a different way. Later, as the library lights dimmed, Frank tucked the letters into a binder, each one labeled and dated. He ran a finger along the spine, smiling to himself. When someone asked him why he kept doing these readings, he gave his favorite answer, the one Grace had unknowingly given him. Because dreams don't retire, he said. They just find new storytellers. The small crowd applauded softly, the sound mingling with the gentle hum of rain against the windows. Frank looked down at the latest photo Grace had sent, a view of Paris at dusk, the city glowing gold beneath the clouds. He smiled, tucking it into his pocket, as if carrying a piece of the city with him. The park was quiet in the late afternoon, painted in the warm hues of early autumn. Gold leaves scattered across the path, rustling softly beneath Frank's slow steps. The air was cool but kind, the kind of air that carried memory, crisp, gentle, familiar. He reached the bench at the far end of the park, the one beneath the old oak tree near the pond. The brass plaque gleamed softly. In the light, newly polished but already weathered by a few passing rains, for the one who waited for Paris. Frank brushed his hand over the words, smiling faintly. The bench had been installed just a month ago, a small memorial, simple but perfect. He'd picked this spot himself because Eleanor had always loved this park. It was where they used to walk on Sundays, hand in hand, when life still felt wide and full. He sat down slowly, easing into the familiar creak of the wood. For a while he said nothing. The sounds of children laughing in the distance, the faint splash of ducks in the pond, and the whispering trees filled the silence. From his pocket, he pulled out a letter, one of Grace's from Paris. The edges were soft from being reread too many times. He opened it again, his eyes tracing her handwriting. Grandpa, I went to Montmartre today. I thought about you the whole time. I swear I could almost hear your voice explaining every corner. He chuckled quietly. I probably would have bored her to tears with history lessons. A voice behind him replied softly, she would have loved every word. Frank turned to see Laura standing a few feet away, holding 2 takeaway coffee cups. She smiled, a little uncertain, and handed one to him. Thought you could use something warm. He took it gratefully. Thank you. She sat beside him, the bench creaking again under the shared weight. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was full, like music between notes. Laura stared at the plaque. It's beautiful, she said finally. Mom would have loved it. Frank nodded. She waited long enough. Feels right that she finally got her place here. Laura took a sip of coffee, her gaze distant. You finally made it, she said softly. Frank smiled, watching the pond ripple in the fading light. We all did, in our own way. The words hung there, carried by the wind, warm and true. Laura nodded slowly, understanding. The journey, the fights, the silence, the healing, had all led here, not to a grand moment, but to this simple, quiet one. I still think about her, Laura said, voice barely above a whisper. So do I, Frank replied, but it doesn't hurt anymore, not like it used to. Now it's more like gratitude. Laura turned to look at him. For what? For the fact that we got to love her at all, he said simply. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Instead, she smiled. Small, real, peaceful. They sat in silence again, watching the sky shift from gold to rose to a deep amber glow. The pond caught the reflection perfectly. the way the Eiffel Tower once had, the same shimmer of light and longing. Frank leaned back, the warmth of the coffee seeping into his hands. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think closure meant an ending, but it doesn't. It's just a quieter beginning." Laura looked at him, her expression soft. "And what's this beginning?" He smiled. "Whatever comes next, without fear, without guilt, just life." The wind moved through the trees again, carrying the faint scent of leaves and rain. Somewhere in the distance, a street musician began playing an old tune on a saxophone, something slow and familiar, the kind that sounded faintly like a Paris melody. Frank chuckled. "Even New York's starting to hum like Paris now." Laura laughed softly. "Guess the city caught your story too." He tilted his head back, watching the last rays of sunlight fade through the branches. The glow hit the brass plaque perfectly, for the one who waited for Paris, making the words shimmer as if alive. For the first time in years, Frank felt completely still, not haunted by what he'd lost, but surrounded by everything he still had. Laura placed her hand gently over his. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The peace said enough. As the music drifted closer, the screen of life seemed to narrow, the golden light softening, the world settling into calm. The camera would linger on the plaque, the reflection of sunset gleaming like the Eiffel glow, love, loss, and legacy, all in one quiet moment. The emotional closure landed not with tears, but with warmth. The morning came quiet, soft, and golden, the kind of light that slipped through curtains like memory, gentle but impossible to ignore. Frank sat by the window, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, the Paris scrapbook open before him. The pages were filled with moments that no longer hurt to touch, ticket stubs, photographs, and a postcard or two, each a piece of his journey toward peace. A knock came at the door. The mailman waved through the glass. "Morning, Mr. Wells. Got something special from overseas." Frank stood slowly, smiling as he took the small bundle of mail. There it was again, the now familiar handwriting, a little messy, full of life. Grace Wells, Paris. He returned to his seat, fingers steady as he turned the postcard over. The drawing stopped him cold. It was a sketch, hand-drawn, delicate, alive, of a cafe he knew by heart. The same one he'd sat in with Irene, and before that, dreamed of with Eleanor. Every detail was there. The striped awning, the little tables, even the vase of daisies that always sat in the window. At the bottom, written in Grace's soft cursive, were just 6 words. "For you, Grandpa. Paris isn't lonely anymore." Frank let out a small, breathy laugh, the kind that trembles between joy and ache. His hand covered his mouth for a moment, steadying the emotion that rose too fast, too full. Then the laughter melted into something quieter, deeper, the sound of a man completely undone by love and legacy. He leaned back in his chair, holding the postcard up toward the light. The pencil lines caught the morning sun, and for a second, it almost looked alive. The cafe shimmering as if the scene itself breathed. Again, his eyes wandered to the shelf beside him, the one holding Eleanor's photo. She smiled there still, the same soft, knowing smile she'd worn since the day they'd met. The photo frame sat beside the Paris scrapbook, now weathered from use, its spine loose from years of handling. Frank stood, moved carefully across the room, and placed the postcard right beside her picture. "She found it," he whispered. "Our place." The radio in the background shifted songs, an instrumental, slow and tender, something that sounded almost like the music that played that night in the vineyard. The melody filled the room, wrapping around him like a memory that refused to fade. He looked out the window toward the trees beyond the yard. The wind moved gently through the branches, scattering leaves that glowed gold against the morning light. He could almost see Grace walking along the Seine, sketchbook in hand, laughing at something unseen. And maybe, just maybe, Eleanor beside her, both of them at peace. Frank's gaze drifted back to the open scrapbook. The last page was blank, one he'd never filled, not out of forgetfulness, but because he hadn't known how to end it. Now, maybe he did. He picked up a pen, hesitated, then wrote a single line beneath the date. Dreams don't end. They continue in others. The pen trembled slightly as he set it down. He traced the edge of Grace's postcard once more, then reached over and closed the scrapbook slowly. The soft thud of it shutting sounded final, but not sad. It was the sound of a story complete. The camera of life, if it had one, would linger on him. The quiet dignity of an old man who had lost and gained and lived enough to know the difference. His eyes glistened, but his smile never left. He whispered, his voice steady but tender. Bon voyage, my girl. The radio music swelled. Strings, faint piano, something beautiful and unresolved. The light caught the edges of the scrapbook, the framed photo, and finally, the postcard. The one that said it all. Paris isn't lonely anymore. The screen of his world faded slowly to black, leaving behind only the echo of a life reclaimed, one defined not by what was lost, but by what endured. A final glimmer of sunlight crossed the glass, then disappeared, fade out,